Welcome to my channel Midnight Stories, where you find horror stories that scare you. Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. This happened in the 1995. The year was etched in my memory, a time when the world seemed simpler, yet held secrets darker than I could have imagined. I was 28 years old, still naive enough to believe that the monsters in this world were only human. How wrong I was. The cold had just begun to creep in, the kind that finds its way under your bones. Vermont in autumn was a sight to behold, but it came with a chill that seemed to whisper warnings to those who ventured too deep into its forests. I wasn't exactly someone who thrived on a life of normalcy. Most people would see my job, fixing broken-down cabins for rich out-of-towners, as mundane, but I'd always found it peaceful. There's something about working with your hands that calms the mind, gives you space to breathe, away from the noise of the world. My name's Evan Dodd, born and raised in Rhode Island, in the kind of small town no one's ever heard of. I grew up fixing things alongside my old man, who had a talent for turning trash into treasure. He was the first to teach me that anything broken can be fixed, except people. People break, and they stay that way. Maybe that's why I prefer the solitude of the woods, working with tools instead of faces. I had taken up a job for a client who owned one of those luxury log cabins way out on the edge of a forest, just outside Stowe. The kind where you'd expect to find a guy in a flannel shirt chopping wood, living the good old simple life. Except these cabins were rented out by people who wouldn't know the business end of an axe if you handed it to them. I was hired to fix some electrical wiring issues. Easy enough, but the cabin was empty when I arrived. Keys left under a fake rock by the door. Real original. As I pulled up in my beat-up Ford pickup, the sun was already dipping below the tree line, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was an impressive structure. All dark wood and large windows, the kind of place that screamed money. But there was something off about it, even from the outside. The windows seemed too dark, like they were absorbing the fading light rather than reflecting it. I grabbed my toolbox from the back of the truck, the familiar weight of it grounding me as I approached the cabin. The gravel crunched under my boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But when I turned to look, there was nothing but trees and lengthening shadows. The key was exactly where they said it would be, under a fake rock that stuck out like a sore thumb among the real ones. I shook my head, wondering not for the first time about the stupidity of rich folks. As I inserted the key into the lock, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. The lock turned with a heavy click that echoed in the silence. The door swung open with a creak that would have been at home in any horror movie. I chuckled to myself, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. "Get a grip, Evan," I muttered. "It's just another job." Stepping inside, I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers brushing against the cool wall until I found it. Nothing happened. Right, the electrical issues. That's why I was here. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The interior of the cabin was all high-end rustic chic, a designer's idea of what a woodland retreat should look like. Plush leather sofas, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, and enough taxidermy to make a PETA activist faint. But something felt off. The air was thick, stagnant, carrying a faint odor that I couldn't quite place. I made my way to the electrical panel, hidden behind a painting of a serene forest scene that looked nothing like the real thing outside. As I worked, the smell grew stronger, something sour, like spoiled meat. I figured it was probably a dead animal under the porch. Raccoons get in, they die, you deal with it. I'm not exactly squeamish. When you've fixed half-rotted floorboards and dealt with leaky sewage pipes, your threshold for gross things shoots way up. But this was something else. It wasn't just the smell of decay. There was something else mixed in, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to focus on the wiring, but my mind kept wandering, imagining what could be causing that stench. After about an hour of work, I had the lights functioning again. The cabin sprang to life, warm light flooding every corner. But instead of making things better, The light only seemed to emphasize the wrongness of the place. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive somehow. I packed up my tools, eager to get out of there and back to civilization. But as I reached for the door handle, a sound from outside froze me in place. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. My heart rate spiked, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear. Silence followed, broken only by the pounding of my own heart. I waited, counting the seconds, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, closer this time, a sound that was almost a word but too distorted, too inhuman to be language. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing. What the hell was out there? A bear? A wolf? But I knew deep down that it was neither of those things. Whatever was making that sound was something else entirely. The smell hit me again, stronger than ever. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. Somehow, impossibly, it was inside the cabin with me. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam shaking as I swept it across the room. And there in the corner, where I swear there had been nothing but empty space a moment before, stood a figure. It was hunched over, its form a twisted amalgamation of man and beast. Matted fur covered its body, but in patches, revealing sickly pale skin underneath. Its face, God, its face. It was like someone had tried to mold human features onto a wolf's skull and gotten it horribly wrong. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew true terror. Those eyes held intelligence, malevolence, and an hunger that chilled me to my core. It tilted its head, regarding me with a curiosity that was somehow more terrifying than outright aggression. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was frozen in place, the next I was yanking the door open and sprinting into the darkness. Behind me I heard the creature let out a howl that was equal parts triumph and hunger. The chase was on. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier in the day had transformed into a nightmare landscape. Branches whipped at my face as I ran. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me. The beam of my flashlight, still clutched in my white-knuckled grip, bounced wildly, creating a strobe effect that only added to my disorientation. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush with a speed that defied its awkward appearance. The sound of its breathing, heavy and wet, seemed to be right at my heels no matter how fast I ran. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming for rest, but terror kept me moving. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction had been lost in the chaos of the chase. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to find some way to escape this nightmare. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. I had a moment of weightlessness before I was tumbling down a steep incline, my world becoming a dizzying blur of earth and sky. I came to a jarring stop at the bottom, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment I lay there, gasping for breath, every part of my body aching. The silence was absolute. Had I lost it? I struggled to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ribs. Probably bruised, maybe cracked. I swept my flashlight around, trying to get my bearings. I was in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. And there, at the edge of the clearing, stood a structure that made my blood run cold. It was a cabin, almost identical to the one I had fled from, but this one was older, more decrepit. Its windows were dark, empty sockets, and the wood was gray with age. How was this possible? Had I somehow run in a circle? A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing, just shadows and trees, but I knew it was out there, watching, waiting. I was being hunted. I turned back to the cabin. As terrifying as the thought of entering another enclosed space was, I knew I couldn't keep running forever. Maybe, just maybe, I could find something inside to defend myself with. The door hung askew on its hinges, opening with a groan that seemed to echo through the forest. The smell hit me immediately, that same sour, rotten odor, but stronger here, more concentrated. I gagged, fighting the urge to vomit. The beam of my flashlight revealed a scene of chaos. Furniture was overturned, claw marks scored deep into the walls, and everywhere, dark stains that I desperately hoped were just rust or mold, but knew in my gut were something far worse. I moved deeper into the cabin, my footsteps creaking on the warped floorboards. Each sound made me flinch, certain that it would bring the creature crashing in after me. But the silence held, broken only by my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. In what must have once been the living room, I found a fireplace, and there, mounted above it, was an old hunting rifle. I almost sobbed with relief. With shaking hands, I reached up and took it down, praying that it was still functional. The weight of it in my hands was reassuring. I checked the chamber loaded. Whoever had left this place had done so in a hurry, leaving behind something that might just save my life. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, raising the rifle, my finger tightening on the trigger. But what I saw made me hesitate. Standing in the doorway was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, with long dark hair and pale skin. She was wearing a nightgown that might once have been white, but was now stained and tattered. "Hello," I said, my voice hoarse. "Are you lost? We need to get out of here, it's not safe." The girl didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed too large for her face. And then, slowly, she smiled. It was a smile that had too many teeth, sharp and gleaming in the dim light. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. The girl's form began to shift, to grow. Her limbs elongated, her face stretching into that horrific wolf-like visage I had seen before. In a matter of seconds, the innocent child was gone, replaced by the monstrous creature that had been hunting me. I raised the rifle and fired without thinking. The shot was deafening in the confined space of the cabin. The creature jerked backward, dark blood blossoming on its chest. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar of rage and pain that shook the very foundations of the cabin. I fired again and again, each shot driving the thing back a step. But it kept coming, its claws raking the air inches from my face. I could smell its fetid breath, feel the heat radiating off its body. The rifle clicked empty. I had a moment of pure, paralyzing terror before instinct took over. I swung the rifle like a club, catching the creature across its misshapen jaw. It howled, more in anger than pain, and lunged for me. We went down in a tangle of limbs, the creature's weight driving the air from my lungs. Its claws raked across my chest, tearing through my jacket and shirt like they were tissue paper. Pain exploded across my torso, hot and sharp. I fought back with everything I had, punching, kicking, trying desperately to keep its snapping jaws away from my throat. My hand closed around something hard and cold, a piece of the broken rifle. Without thinking, I drove it into the creature's eye with all my strength. The howl it let out this time was one of agony. It reared back, giving me just enough space to scramble away. I didn't hesitate. I ran, ignoring the pain in my chest, the warm flow of blood soaking my shirt. Out into the night I fled with no idea of where I was going. Behind me I could hear the creature's roars of pain and fury fading into the distance, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath. As consciousness slipped away, my last thought was a desperate hope that when I woke up, this would all have been just a nightmare. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the trees. For a moment, I lay there, trying to convince myself that it had all been a dream. But the pain in my chest and the dried blood on my clothes told a different story. With a groan, I pushed myself to my feet. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my body. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing but no less confusing. I had no idea where I was in relation to the road or to my truck. As the events of the night came flooding back, I felt a surge of panic. Was it still out there, hunting me? I strained my ears, but the forest was quiet save for the normal sounds of birds and small animals. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. As I walked, I tried to make sense of what had happened. What was that thing? A werewolf? Some kind of mutant? Or had I simply lost my mind? After what felt like hours of walking, I finally heard the blessed sound of traffic. I quickened my pace, ignoring the protest of my battered body. When I broke through the tree line and saw the road, I almost wept with relief. I flagged down the first car I saw, probably scaring the hell out of the elderly couple inside with my wild appearance. They were kind enough to drive me to the nearest hospital, though I could see the fear and concern in their eyes as they glanced at me in the rearview mirror. At the hospital, I spun a tale of being attacked by a bear while hiking. It was easier than trying to explain the truth, which I barely understood myself. The doctors patched me up, marveling at the depth and pattern of the claw marks on my chest. "You're lucky to be alive," one of them told me. I just nodded, unable to find the words to express how true that was. The police came to take my statement. I stuck to my bear story, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They promised to investigate, to look for the bear that had attacked me. I almost laughed. What would they do if they actually found what was out there? After I was released from the hospital, I went back to my apartment in town, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every noise made me jump. I tried to go back to work, to resume my normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. The world had changed, or maybe I had. I found myself researching folklore, myths about shapeshifters and monsters. I scoured news reports for any similar attacks, any sign that what I had encountered wasn't unique. Weeks passed, and slowly the physical wounds began to heal, but the mental scars remained. I couldn't sleep without reliving that night in my dreams. I started drinking more than I should, trying to numb the constant fear and doubt. And then, about a month after the incident, I received a phone call. It was from the owner of the cabin, the one I had originally been hired to work on. He was calling to ask if I could come back out, finish the job I had started. My first instinct was to refuse, to hang up and never think about that place again. But something stopped me. A need for closure, perhaps. Or maybe deep down a part of me needed to know if it had all been real. I agreed to go back, but not alone. I convinced a buddy of mine, a guy I'd known since high school, to come with me. I didn't tell him the whole story, just that I'd had a bad experience there and didn't want to go alone. The drive out to the cabin was tense. Every mile brought back memories of that night, making my palms sweat and my heart race. My friend Tom tried to keep up a conversation, but I was too distracted to engage. As we turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, I felt a sense of dread settling over me. The cabin looked just as it had that day, picturesque and innocent in the afternoon sun. But I knew better now. I knew what secrets the woods could hide. We got out of the truck, Tom whistling as he took in the view. "Nice place," he said. "No wonder rich folks pay top dollar for this kind of solitude." I grunted in response, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But still, that feeling of being watched persisted. We entered the cabin, and I was hit with a wave of déjà vu. Everything was as I had left it that night, except for one thing. The smell was gone. The air was fresh and clean, with no hint of the rotting odor that had permeated the place before. I set to work finishing the electrical job, my movements mechanical as my mind raced. Tom wandered around admiring the expensive furnishings and occasionally making small talk. I was grateful for his presence, even if he didn't know the real reason I'd asked him to come. As the sun began to set, I felt my anxiety spike. "We should get going," I said, packing up my tools with shaky hands. "It'll be dark soon." Tom looked at me oddly. "You okay, man? You've been jumpy all day." I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired. Let's head out." We stepped outside, and I locked the door behind us. The forest was quiet, too quiet. That same stillness that had preceded the attack last time. And then I heard it. A twig snapping in the woods. Tom heard it too, his head turning towards the sound. "Probably just a deer," he said. But I knew better, my body tensed, ready to run. "Tom," I said, my voice low and urgent, "we need to leave, now." He must have heard the fear in my voice because he didn't argue. We hurried to the truck, the gravel crunching loudly under our feet. That's when the howl split the air. It was the same sound I'd heard that night, a sound that still haunted my nightmares. Tom froze, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" "Get in the truck," I yelled, already scrambling for the driver's side. We peeled out of there, gravel spraying behind us. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing, a large, dark shape emerging from the trees. Tom was yelling, asking what was going on, what we were running from, but I couldn't answer. All my focus was on getting us out of there as fast as possible. We made it back to town in record time. I dropped Tom off at his place, brushing off his questions with vague answers. I knew he'd probably never want to work with me again, but that was a small price to pay for both of us making it out alive. That night, as I sat in my apartment nursing a strong drink, I came to a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows and running from my own memories. I needed answers. The next day, I started making calls. I reached out to local historians, to Native American tribes in the area, to anyone who might have information about the region's history and folklore. Most of them brushed me off, thinking I was just another conspiracy theorist or thrill seeker. But one person agreed to meet with me, an elderly woman named Margaret, who claimed her family had lived in the area for generations. She agreed to talk to me, but only in person and only on her terms. I drove out to her home, a small, well-kept house on the outskirts of town. Margaret was waiting for me on the porch, a tiny, wizened figure with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said as soon as I got out of my truck. It wasn't really a question. I nodded and she sighed, gesturing for me to follow her inside. The interior of her house was cluttered but cozy, filled with books and odd trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum. We sat at her kitchen table and Margaret fixed me with a steady gaze. "What you encountered," she said, "is something my people have known about for centuries. We call it the Wendigo." She went on to tell me a story that sounded like something out of a horror novel. The Wendigo, she said, was once a man, a chief of her tribe, strong and respected. But during a harsh winter when food was scarce, he turned to cannibalism to survive. The act twisted him, both body and soul, turning him into a creature driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. "But that was hundreds of years ago," I protested. "How could it still be alive?" Margaret shook her head. "The Wendigo isn't alive in the way you and I are. It's a spirit, a curse. It can possess people, animals, even take physical form when its hunger is strong enough." I sat back, my mind reeling. It sounded insane, and yet it fit with what I had seen. The creature's ability to change form, its intelligence, its relentless pursuit. "How do I stop it?" I asked. Margaret's expression turned grave. "You don't," she said. "The Wendigo can't be killed. Not really. The best you can do is avoid it, ward against it." She gave me a small pouch filled with herbs and what looked like animal bones. "Carry this with you," she said. "It won't stop the Wendigo, but it might mask your scent, make you less attractive as prey." I took the pouch, not sure if I believed in its power, but willing to try anything. As I stood to leave, Margaret caught my arm. "Be careful," she said, her eyes intense. "Once the Wendigo has your scent, it never forgets. It will hunt you for the rest of your life." I left Margaret's house with more questions than answers, but also with a sense of validation. I wasn't crazy. What I had seen was real, even if it defied rational explanation. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into research. I read every book I could find on Native American mythology, on cryptids and supernatural creatures. I joined online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena, sharing my story anonymously and looking for similar accounts. And I found them. Not many, but enough to form a pattern. Stories of hikers gone missing in the woods, of campers found torn apart in ways that didn't match any known animal attack. Most were dismissed as bear attacks or the work of deranged humans, but I knew better now. I also started preparing. I bought camping gear, survival equipment, weapons. I trained myself in wilderness survival, in tracking. If the Wendigo was going to hunt me, I was determined to be ready. But even as I prepared, I knew that I was just postponing the inevitable. Sooner or later, I would have to face the creature again. The question was, would I be the hunter or the hunted? It was almost a year to the day after my first encounter when I decided to go back. Not to the cabin this time, but deep into the woods where I had first seen the Wendigo. I knew it was probably suicide, but I couldn't live with the constant fear, the looking over my shoulder. One way or another, this had to end. I left a letter for my family explaining everything. They'd probably think I was crazy, but at least they'd know what happened to me if I didn't come back. The forest was quiet as I hiked in, my backpack heavy with supplies. I had Margaret's charm around my neck for whatever good it might do. As night fell, I made camp in a small clearing, setting up wards as Margaret had taught me, lines of salt, symbols carved into the trees. For 3 days, nothing happened. I ranged further into the forest each day, always returning to my protected camp at night. On the 4th day, as I was considering giving up and heading back to civilization, I found it. Or rather, it found me. I was following a game trail when I heard it, that low, guttural growl that had haunted my nightmares for the past year. I spun around, my hand going to the rifle slung across my back. There it stood, at the edge of a small clearing, just as terrifying as I remembered, its misshapen body a mockery of both man and beast, its eyes fixed on me with a hunger that was all too human. For a long moment we stared at each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, it smiled, that terrible, too-wide smile full of razor-sharp teeth. And it spoke. "Evan," it said, its voice a rasping growl that barely sounded like speech at all. "You came back." I raised my rifle, my hand surprisingly steady. "You know my name," I said. It tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. "I know everything about you, Evan. Your scent, your fear, your taste." A shudder ran through me at its words. "What are you?" I demanded. The creature's smile widened. "I am hunger," it said. "I am the winter that never ends, the emptiness that can never be filled." It took a step forward, and I tightened my finger on the trigger. "Stay back," I warned. It laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "Or what? You'll shoot me, go ahead, it won't stop me, nothing can stop me." I knew it was probably right, but I fired anyway. The shot echoed through the forest, and the creature staggered back a step. Dark blood oozed from the wound in its chest, but it didn't fall. Instead, it looked down at the injury with something like curiosity. "My turn," it growled and lunged. I fired again and again, each shot driving it back but never stopping it. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have killed me already if it wanted to. As I fired my last shot, the creature finally fell to one knee. But even as it knelt there, bleeding from a dozen wounds, it laughed. "Good," it said. "You're strong. You'll last longer than the others." "Others?" I asked, even as I fumbled to reload. The Wendigo grinned, blood staining its teeth. "So many others. Hunters, hikers, campers. All of them thought they could fight me. All of them failed." As it spoke, its wounds began to close, the bullets pushing themselves out of its flesh. I watched in horror as it stood, seemingly unharmed. "You can't win, Evan," it said. "But don't worry, I won't kill you, not yet. The hunt is too much fun." With that, it turned and loped off into the forest, leaving me standing there, my useless rifle still aimed at where it had been. I made it back to my camp in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had happened. The Wendigo could have killed me, but it chose not to. It wanted to keep hunting me, to prolong the game. As I sat by my campfire that night, unable to sleep, I realized the truth of Margaret's words. The Wendigo couldn't be killed, couldn't be stopped. It would hunt me for the rest of my life. But as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I made a decision. I wouldn't run anymore. I wouldn't hide. If the Wendigo wanted a hunt, I'd give it one. But this time I wouldn't be the prey. I packed up my camp and headed back to civilization, my mind already planning. I had research to do, skills to learn. The next time I faced the Wendigo, I'd be ready. As I reached the edge of the forest, I turned back for one last look. For a moment I thought I saw a shape moving among the trees, watching me. But then it was gone, and I was left with nothing but the wind in the leaves and the promise of a hunt to come. I don't know how this will end. Maybe I'll find a way to destroy the Wendigo, or maybe it'll eventually catch me. But one thing's for sure, I'm not going down without a fight. So if you're ever in the forests of Vermont, and you hear something moving in the shadows, something that sounds almost human but not quite, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because the hunt is on, and in these woods, we're all prey. The months that followed my second encounter with the Wendigo were a blur of research, training, and preparation. I quit my job as a handyman, using my savings to fund what had become an all-consuming obsession. My family and the few friends I had left watched with growing concern as I withdrew from normal life, spending days at a time holed up in my apartment or disappearing into the woods for weeks on end. I pored over every scrap of information I could find about the Wendigo and similar creatures from folklore around the world. I reached out to academics, folklorists, and self-proclaimed monster hunters. Most dismissed me as a crank, but a few listened. Some even shared their own stories, tales of encounters with things that shouldn't exist in our rational modern world. One contact, a professor of anthropology at a small college in Maine, pointed me towards an obscure text. It was a journal, supposedly written by a French trapper in the early 19th century, who claimed to have encountered a wendigo in the forests of Quebec. The trapper wrote of a ritual, a way to bind the wendigo, to trap it in a physical form that could be destroyed. I spent months tracking down a copy of the journal, eventually finding it in the private collection of a reclusive millionaire with an interest in the occult. It cost me nearly everything I had left to acquire it, but as I held the weathered leather-bound book in my hands, I felt a surge of hope for the first time in years. The ritual described in the journal was complex, requiring specific ingredients and astronomical alignments. Some of the components were common enough: sage, cedar, the bones of a deer. Others were more problematic: the heart of a wolf killed under a full moon, the blood of a man who had tasted human flesh. I told myself I had lines I wouldn't cross, limits to how far I'd go. But as I delved deeper into the dark world of monster hunting and occult rituals, those lines began to blur. I spent the next year preparing, gathering what I needed for the ritual. I learned to track and hunt, honing skills I'd never imagined I'd need. I practiced the words of the ritual until I could recite them in my sleep, the strange syllables of a language long dead rolling off my tongue. All the while I felt the presence of the wendigo, not always seeing it but feeling it. A shadow at the edge of my vision, a whisper just beyond hearing. It was watching me, I knew, waiting, perhaps even anticipating the confrontation to come. There were times when I questioned my sanity. Was I chasing a real monster, or had I created one in my mind to give form to my fears? But then I'd look at the scars on my chest, feel the phantom pain of claws raking across my skin, and I'd know. The wendigo was real, and it was waiting for me. As the date of the ritual approached, a night when the moon would be full and Mars would be ascending in the sky, I made my final preparations. I said goodbye to my family, trying to ignore the worry and fear in their eyes. I knew they thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but I couldn't explain. They wouldn't understand. Maybe it was better that way. I drove back to Vermont, to the forests where it had all begun. As I set up my camp and began laying out the components for the ritual, I felt a sense of finality. One way or another, it would end here. The night of the ritual arrived, clear and cold. The full moon hung low in the sky, bathing the forest in silvery light. I began the ritual as the journal had described, creating a circle of salt and herbs, placing candles at specific points. As I worked, I felt the forest grow still around me. The normal sounds of night, the rustle of small animals, the call of owls, faded away, leaving an unnatural silence. I began to chant, the words feeling heavy and strange in my mouth. The candles flickered, their flames growing taller, casting wild shadows across the clearing. The air grew thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain, but could feel prickling across my skin. And then I heard it. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Something was approaching. I continued the chant, my voice growing louder as I fought to keep it steady. The journal had been clear. Once begun, the ritual could not be interrupted, or the consequences would be dire. It emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, the wendigo. It looked different now, larger, more bestial. Its antlers had grown, branching out like a crown of bones. Its eyes glowed with an inner fire, fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Evan," it growled, its voice a sound of winter storms and cracking ice. "What game are you playing now?" I didn't respond, focusing all my will on continuing the chant. The wendigo tilted its head, curiosity mixing with the hunger in its eyes. It took a step forward, then another. I could see the moment it felt the barrier of the ritual circle, an invisible force that made it pause. Its expression shifted from curiosity to rage. "You think your little magic trick can stop me?" it snarled. "I am eternal, boy. I have walked these forests since before your kind learned to make fire. I cannot be bound. I cannot be stopped." It hurled itself at the barrier, claws raking at the air. I flinched but kept chanting, the words coming faster now as I neared the end of the ritual. The wendigo howled, a sound of fury and frustration that shook the trees. It began to pace around the circle, probing for weaknesses, its claws leaving gouges in the earth. As I spoke the final words of the ritual, I felt something shift in the air. The candle flames shot up, becoming pillars of fire that illuminated the clearing as bright as day. The Wendigo let out a roar of pain and rage as tendrils of light began to wrap around it, binding it, pulling it towards the center of the circle. For a moment I thought it had worked. The Wendigo was being drawn in, its form shifting and twisting as the magic of the ritual took hold. But then I saw its eyes. There was no fear there, no defeat, only a terrible, knowing amusement. It began to laugh, a sound that chilled me to my very soul. "Oh, Evan," it said, its voice somehow clear despite the maelstrom of energy surrounding us. "Did you really think it would be this easy?" With a motion almost too fast to follow, it reached out and grabbed me, pulling me into the circle. Pain exploded through me as I felt the magic of the ritual tear at my flesh, my bones, my very being. The last thing I remember is the Wendigo's face, inches from mine, its fetid breath hot on my skin as it whispered, "The hunt isn't over yet, Evan. It's only just begun." Then darkness took me, and I knew no more. I woke up in a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell telling me where I was before I even opened my eyes. When I did, I saw my sister Jane asleep in a chair beside the bed. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes and her clothes rumpled as if she'd been wearing them for days. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and raw. The small sound I made was enough to wake Jane, though. Her eyes flew open, and when she saw me awake, her face crumpled with relief. "Evan," she breathed, grabbing my hand. "Oh God, Evan, we thought we'd lost you." I managed to croak out a request for water, and Jane helped me sip from a plastic cup. As the cool liquid soothed my throat, I tried to piece together what had happened. "How?" I started, my voice still rough. "How did I get here?" Jane's expression turned troubled. "Some hikers found you," she said. "In the woods. Evan, you were in bad shape. The doctors, they said." She trailed off, shaking her head. "How long?" I asked. 3 weeks, Jane replied. "You've been in and out of consciousness. Do you remember what happened?" I closed my eyes, trying to recall. Flashes came back to me, the ritual, the Wendigo, being pulled into the circle of power. But it was all jumbled, mixed with fever dreams and nightmares. I wasn't sure what was real and what wasn't. "I'm not sure," I said finally. "It's all a blur." Jane nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "The police have some questions," she said hesitantly. "When you're feeling up to it, they found things at your campsite." I tensed, remembering the components of the ritual. How much had they found? How much could I explain? "Evan," Jane said, her voice low and serious. "What were you doing out there? Mom and Dad, they're worried sick. We all are. These past few years you've been different, obsessed with something. Please talk to me. Let me help." I looked at my sister, saw the genuine concern and love in her eyes. For a moment I was tempted to tell her everything, about the Wendigo, the hunt, the ritual. But how could I? How could I drag her into this nightmare? "I'm sorry," I said instead. "I know I've worried you all. I needed to figure some things out. I promise I'm done with all that now." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but I forced a smile. Jane didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded, squeezing my hand. Over the next few days, as I regained my strength, I pieced together what had happened after the ritual. The hikers who found me had described a scene of devastation. Trees toppled, the earth scorched in a perfect circle, and at the center, me, barely alive. The police had questions, of course, about the strange items found at my campsite, about what I was doing so deep in the woods. I fed them a story about extreme camping, about wanting to test my survival skills. They didn't seem to fully buy it, but without evidence of any crime, they eventually let it go. As I recovered, I pored over every detail I could remember from that night. The ritual had failed, or had it? The Wendigo had seemed amused, confident. But something had happened. The magic had been real, had affected both of us. But how? I was released from the hospital after a month, still weak but healing. My family insisted I come stay with them while I recuperated. I agreed, knowing it would ease their minds. but my thoughts were already turning back to the forest, to the unfinished business waiting for me there. It was on a quiet afternoon, about a week after I'd moved in with my parents, that I first noticed it. I was sitting on the back porch, enjoying the warm sun, when a shadow fell over me. I looked up, expecting to see a cloud passing over the sun. Instead, I saw antlers, just for a moment silhouetted against the sky. When I blinked, they were gone. But I knew. The Wendigo had followed me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A soft scratching at my window, a low growl that might have been the wind, if I didn't know better. I lay still, my heart pounding, as the sounds continued for what felt like hours before finally fading away. In the morning, I found claw marks on the outside of my window frame. I knew then that it wasn't over. The hunt continued. But something had changed. The rules were different now. As the weeks passed, I began to notice other changes. My senses seemed sharper. I could hear things I shouldn't be able to hear, smell scents that were too faint for human senses. And sometimes, when I looked in the mirror, I could swear my eyes had a faint glow to them. The ritual hadn't failed, it had changed me, and I suspected it had changed the Wendigo too. I started making plans. I couldn't stay with my family. I was putting them in danger just by being near them. I needed to leave, to draw the Wendigo away. But more than that, I needed to end this, once and for all. The hunt was on, but this time I wasn't the prey. I was the hunter. And somewhere out there in the dark forests of the world, the Wendigo was waiting. As I packed my bags, preparing to disappear into the night, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For just a moment I saw something else looking back at me. Something wild, hungry, with antlers beginning to sprout from its brow. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew the truth now. The ritual hadn't just changed me. It had started to turn me into something else. Something like the Wendigo. The question was, could I find a way to stop it before the transformation was complete? Or was I doomed to become the very thing I had been hunting? As I slipped out of the house in the dead of night, leaving behind a note for my family, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The hunt was on, and this time it was personal. Whatever the outcome, I knew one thing for certain: the forests of the world would never be the same again, and neither would I. The years that followed were a blur of constant movement, research, and increasingly desperate attempts to halt my transformation. I traveled across North America, seeking out every shaman, medicine man, and occult practitioner I could find. Some offered temporary solutions, rituals that would slow the change, herbs that would dull the growing hunger inside me. But nothing stopped it completely. All the while I felt the Wendigo's presence, sometimes distant, sometimes so close I could almost smell its fetid breath. We were locked in a dance, predator and prey, though it wasn't always clear which of us was which. I learned to use my new abilities: enhanced strength, heightened senses, and almost supernatural ability to track. But with each passing month it became harder to control the hunger, the rage, the desire to hunt not just the Wendigo, but anything that moved. It was in the forests of northern Canada that I finally understood what I had to do. An old Cree elder, her face lined with age and wisdom, listened to my story without judgment. "The Wendigo is not just a creature," she told me, her voice crackling like dry leaves. "It is a spirit of hunger, of winter, of the darkness in men's souls. To defeat it, you must defeat the hunger within yourself." I spent months with her, learning techniques to control my transformation, to channel the power without succumbing to the hunger. And all the while, I felt the Wendigo drawing closer. The final confrontation came on a moonless night in the depths of winter. I stood in a clearing, snow crunching under my feet, my breath steaming in the frigid air. I no longer needed to call the Wendigo. It was there, emerging from the shadows between the trees. It had changed too, larger now, more monstrous, its antlers a crown of jagged bone. But its eyes were almost human, filled with a hunger that mirrored my own. "So," it growled, its voice like breaking ice, "the hunt ends here." I nodded, feeling the power surge within me. My own antlers, smaller but sharp, pushed through my skin, claws extended from my fingertips. "One way or another," I agreed. We clashed in a fury of claw and fang, of primal rage and ancient hunger. The forest around us shook with the force of our battle. Trees splintered, the ground cracked, as two forces of nature collided. I fought with everything I had, every technique I'd learned, every ounce of humanity I still possessed. But the Wendigo was ancient, powerful, fueled by centuries of hunger and cunning. As we fought, I felt myself slipping, the beast within threatening to take over completely. It would have been so easy to give in, to embrace the hunger and become like the creature I fought. Part of me wanted to. But then I remembered my family, my home, all the people I'd met on my journey. I remembered what it meant to be human. In that moment of clarity, I saw my opportunity. The Wendigo, sensing my momentary weakness, lunged for my throat. But I was ready. I sidestepped its attack and drove my hand into its chest, fingers closing around its heart. The Wendigo's eyes widened in shock and something else, recognition, perhaps even respect. "Well played, Hunter," it rasped. With a final surge of strength, I tore its heart from its chest. The Wendigo's body began to dissolve, turning to ash and blowing away on the winter wind. Its essence, I knew, would linger, waiting for another host, another victim of desperate hunger. But for now, at least, it was gone. I stood alone in the clearing, the Wendigo's heart slowly turning to ash in my hand. I could feel my own transformation reversing, the antlers receding, the claws turning back to human nails. The hunger was still there, would always be there, but now I knew I could control it. As the first light of dawn broke over the trees, I turned and began the long walk back to civilization. I had a lot to answer for, a lot to make right. But I was alive and I was human, and for now that was enough. I returned home, trying to rebuild the life I'd left behind. It wasn't easy. There were questions I couldn't answer, gaps in my history I couldn't explain. But slowly, I began to heal, to reconnect with the world I'd left behind. I still feel the pull of the forest sometimes, still wake from dreams of the hunt with the taste of blood in my mouth. But I've learned to live with it, to use what I've gained without losing who I am. I keep watch now, for signs of the Wendigo's return. I know it's out there, waiting. And when it returns, I'll be ready. Because the hunt never really ends. It just changes form. So if you're ever in the deep woods and you feel eyes upon you, hear a twig snap behind you, run, or stand and fight. But whatever you do, don't give in to the hunger. Because once you do, the real hunt begins. And trust me, you don't want to see how it ends. This happened in 2003. I was 31 years old at the time, living a quiet life in northern Montana. My name is Eamon Blaylock, and what I'm about to tell you changed everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a crisp autumn evening when my phone rang. I had just finished my shift at Hanson's Hardware, where I'd been working since I was 22. The familiar ringtone echoed through my small cabin, nestled at the edge of town. I picked up, recognizing the number of my old friend, Oren Skye. "Eamon." Oren's voice was tight, strained in a way I'd never heard before. "I need your help. It's Finn. He's gone missing." Finn was Oren's cousin, a city boy who'd come to stay with him for a few months. He'd arrived about 6 weeks ago, looking to escape the hustle of urban life and reconnect with nature. I'd met him a couple of times. Seemed like a decent guy, if a bit out of his element in our neck of the woods. "What do you mean missing?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. "He went out to check the traps this morning," Oren explained, his voice cracking slightly. "He should have been back hours ago. I've looked everywhere I could think of, Eamon. It's not like him to just disappear like this." I glanced at the clock, 8:47 p.m. The sun had set over an hour ago, and the temperature was dropping fast. "I'm on my way," I told Oren. "We'll find him." The drive to Oren's place usually took about 15 minutes, but that night it felt like an eternity. The headlights of my old pickup cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. As I drove, my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe Finn had gotten turned around in the woods. It wouldn't be the first time a city slicker lost their bearings out here. Or perhaps he'd twisted an ankle and couldn't make it back. I tried to push away the darker thoughts that crept in, the what-ifs that whispered of more sinister fates. Oren's house came into view, a solitary island of light in the encompassing darkness. He was waiting on the porch, pacing back and forth, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. As I pulled up, he tossed the butt away and hurried to meet me. "Thanks for coming," he said, his face etched with worry. Up close, I could see the toll the day had taken on him. His eyes were bloodshot, his normally neat beard unkempt. "Of course," I replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "Where do we start?" Orrin led me to the edge of his property, where the manicured lawn gave way to the wild tangle of the forest. "He headed out this way," he explained, pointing towards a barely visible trail. "Said he was going to check the traps we'd set last week." I nodded, pulling out my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the gnarled roots and fallen leaves that carpeted the forest floor. "Let's go," I said, taking the lead. As we ventured deeper into the woods, an unsettling silence fell over us. The usual nighttime sounds, the rustle of small animals, the hoot of owls, were conspicuously absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We found the first trap about a half-mile in. It was untouched, the mechanism still set and ready. "He would have reset it if he'd been here," Orrin muttered, more to himself than to me. We pressed on, checking trap after trap. Each one we found was in the same state, undisturbed, as if Finn had never made it this far. The knot of worry in my stomach tightened with each passing minute. After what felt like hours, we reached the last trap. Like the others, it showed no signs of Finn's presence. Orrin slumped against a nearby tree, his face a mask of despair. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where could he have gone?" I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, hoping against hope to catch a glimpse of something, a scrap of clothing, a dropped tool, anything that might give us a clue. But the forest revealed nothing. "We should head back," I said reluctantly. "It's getting late and we're not equipped for a night search. We'll come back at first light, bring more people. We'll find him, Orrin." He nodded, defeated. As we turned to leave, a sound pierced the silence, a long, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Orrin and I exchanged glances, a shiver running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Wolves?" Orrin asked, his voice uncertain. I shook my head slowly. "I've never heard a wolf that sounded like that." The howl came again, closer this time. Without a word, we quickened our pace, the unknown threat spurring us on. It wasn't until we burst out of the tree line, Orrin's house in sight, that we slowed down. As we caught our breath on Orrin's porch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. I turned to my friend, seeing my own unease mirrored in his eyes. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We get some rest," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Tomorrow we organize a proper search party. We'll find Finn, Orrin, I promise." As I drove home that night, the strange howl echoing in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd just made a promise I couldn't keep. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, a faint drizzle misting the air. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning as my mind replayed the events of the previous night. The moment my alarm went off, I was up and moving, fueled by a mix of determination and dread. I arrived at Orrin's place just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. He was already outside talking to a small group of people, other friends and neighbors who'd heard about Finn's disappearance and come to help. I recognized most of them. There was Bill from the post office, Hank, who ran the local diner, and a few others from around town. Orrin looked up as I approached, relief evident on his face. "Eamon," he called out, waving me over. "I was just filling everyone in on what we know so far." I joined the group, nodding in greeting. "Has anyone called the sheriff?" I asked. "I did," Hank replied. "He's on his way with a couple of deputies. Said he'd bring the search dogs, too." A ripple of relief went through the group. Having the sheriff and his dogs would greatly increase our chances of finding Finn. As we waited for them to arrive, we divided into smaller groups and started planning our search strategy. The sheriff, a gruff man named Vance Holbrook, arrived about 20 minutes later. With him were 2 deputies and a pair of German shepherds, their tails wagging eagerly as they sensed the excitement in the air. "All right, folks," Sheriff Holbrook addressed the group, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "Here's how we're going to do this. We'll split into teams of 3 or 4. Each team will take a section of the woods. You've all got radios. Use them. If you find anything, and I mean anything, you call it in immediately. Don't try to be a hero. We don't need anyone else getting lost out there." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the assembled crowd. "And one more thing. There have been reports of unusual animal activity in the area. Probably nothing to worry about, but keep your wits about you. Any questions?" A heavy silence fell over the group. The sheriff's warning had added a new layer of tension to an already fraught situation. After a moment, Orrin spoke up. "What kind of unusual activity?" Sheriff Holbrook hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "Some hikers reported hearing strange noises. Probably just coyotes or something, but better safe than sorry." I caught Orrin's eye, both of us thinking of the eerie howl we'd heard the night before. But neither of us said anything. It seemed too fantastical, too out of place in the harsh light of day. With the teams decided, we set off into the woods. Orrin and I were paired with one of the deputies, a young woman named Rosalind. She was new to the force, having moved to our town just a few months ago, but she carried herself with a quiet competence that was reassuring. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the drizzle intensified, turning into a steady rain. The trees loomed over us, their branches dripping water onto our heads and shoulders. The ground became slick with mud, making each step treacherous. We called Finn's name as we walked, our voices echoing through the trees. But the only response was the patter of rain and the occasional rustle of unseen animals scurrying away from our approach. Hours passed and we found nothing. No signs of Finn, no clues to his whereabouts. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from other teams, but none had any better luck than we did. As the day wore on, a fog began to roll in, further reducing visibility. It crept between the trees like a living thing, tendrils of mist reaching out as if trying to ensnare us. The forest, which I'd known all my life, suddenly seemed alien and hostile. "We should turn back," Rosalind said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "It's getting too dangerous to continue in these conditions." I wanted to argue, to insist that we keep searching, but I knew she was right. The fog was getting thicker by the minute, and the light was failing fast. Reluctantly, I nodded my agreement. As we turned to head back, a sound cut through the gloom, a scream high and terrified coming from somewhere to our left. We froze, straining our ears. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of rain. Then it came again, closer this time. Without a word, we broke into a run, charging through the underbrush towards the source of the scream. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us at every step, but we pushed on. We burst into a small clearing, our flashlights sweeping the area. At first I saw nothing but fog and rain, then my light caught a flash of movement. Something large and dark disappeared into the trees on the far side of the clearing. "Over there!" I shouted, pointing. Rosalind was already moving, her hand on her holstered gun. Orrin and I followed close behind. We crashed through the undergrowth, following the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves. Suddenly the noises stopped. We found ourselves in another clearing, this one larger than the first. Our flashlights danced across the misty air, searching for any sign of movement. "There!" Orrin's voice was tight with fear. He was pointing at something on the ground near the center of the clearing. As we approached, my heart sank. It was a backpack, torn and muddy. I recognized it immediately. It was Finn's. Rosalind knelt down to examine it, her face grim. "It's been ripped open," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at these tears. They almost look like—" She trailed off, but I knew what she was thinking. The jagged rips in the fabric looked like they'd been made by claws. A twig snapped somewhere behind us. We whirled around, Rosalind drawing her gun in one smooth motion. For a long moment we stood there, hearts pounding, eyes straining to penetrate the fog. Then, from the depths of the mist, came a low, rumbling growl. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. It raised the hair on the back of my neck and sent a chill down my spine. "Run," Rosalind whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Run!" We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. Behind us, I could hear something giving chase, something big, moving far faster than any normal animal should be able to. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that fog-shrouded nightmare. All I knew was the burning in my lungs, the ache in my legs, and the terrifying certainty that if we slowed down for even a moment, whatever was chasing us would be upon us. Finally, mercifully, we broke out of the tree line. Orrin's house loomed before us, a beacon of safety in the gathering darkness. We staggered onto the porch, gasping for breath. Rosalind slammed the door behind us, her hands shaking as she threw the lock. For a long moment we just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Then Orrin spoke, his voice hoarse. What was that thing?" I shook my head, unable to find words. How could I describe something I'd only glimpsed in the fog? Something that moved like no animal I'd ever seen? Rosalind was on her radio, calling for backup. Her voice was steady, professional, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She was reporting an animal attack, requesting additional units and animal control. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of our situation sank in. We'd failed to find Finn. Worse, we'd encountered something out there in the woods, something dangerous. And now, as night fell and the fog thickened outside, we were trapped here, waiting for help to arrive. I looked at Orrin, saw the mixture of fear and determination on his face, and knew we were thinking the same thing. This was far from over. Whatever was out there, whatever had taken Finn, we would face it. We had to. For Finn's sake and for our own. As we settled in for a long night, the howl we'd heard the previous evening echoed through the darkness once more. Only this time it sounded triumphant. The next few days passed in a blur of search parties, police interviews, and sleepless nights. The official story was that Finn had been attacked by a bear or mountain lion, despite the fact that such attacks were extremely rare in our area. The sheriff's department combed the woods but found no further sign of Finn or the creature we'd encountered. Orrin was a wreck. He barely ate, barely slept, spending every waking moment either out in the woods searching or poring over maps, trying to figure out where Finn might have gone. I stayed with him as much as I could, worried about what he might do if left alone for too long. It was on the 5th night after Finn's disappearance that everything changed. I was at Orrin's place as usual. We'd spent the day searching a new area of the forest, but like every other day, we'd found nothing. Now, as night fell, we sat on his porch, nursing beers and watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. "I can't stop thinking about what we saw out there," Orrin said, suddenly breaking the silence. "That thing, whatever it was." I nodded, taking a long pull from my beer. I'd been thinking about it too, turning it over and over in my mind. "I've never seen anything move like that," I admitted. "So fast, so unnatural." Orrin leaned forward, his eyes intense. What if it wasn't natural, Eamon? What if it was something else?" I frowned, not sure where he was going with this. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if afraid to voice his thoughts. "I've been doing some research," he said finally, "looking into local legends, old stories, and I found something." He got up and went inside, returning a moment later with a thick leather-bound book. It looked old, the pages yellowed with age. "This is a collection of stories and legends from this area," he explained, flipping through the pages. "Most of it's just folklore, but there's one story that caught my attention." He found the page he was looking for and began to read aloud. "In the dark of the forest, where the trees grow thick and the shadows run deep, there dwells a creature of nightmare. Neither man nor beast, it stalks the unwary, taking them for its own dark purposes. The old ones called it the Skinwalker, for it was said to be able to take on the form of its victims." A chill ran down my spine as Orrin continued reading. The story spoke of a creature that could change its shape at will, of people disappearing in the woods, never to be seen again. It told of a beast that was stronger than any natural animal, faster than any human, with an insatiable hunger for flesh and fear. As Orrin read, I felt a growing sense of unease. The story was eerily similar to what we'd experienced in the woods. The speed of the creature, its unnatural movement, the way it had seemingly appeared and disappeared at will. "Orrin," I said, my voice hesitant, "you don't actually believe this, do you? Skinwalkers, shapeshifters, that's just old legends, campfire stories." He closed the book, his face serious. "A week ago I would have agreed with you, but after what we saw out there, I don't know what to believe anymore." I wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be a rational explanation. But the memory of that night in the fog, of the inhuman growl that had chased us through the woods, was still fresh in my mind. "Even if," I started, then paused, hardly able to believe what I was about to say. Even if something like that did exist, what does it mean for Finn? For us? Oren's eyes met mine, and I saw a mixture of fear and determination in them. It means we're dealing with something far more dangerous than we thought, and it means we need to be prepared. We spent the rest of the night discussing what we'd read, trying to separate fact from fiction, myth from potential reality. It felt surreal, like we'd stepped into some kind of horror movie. But the fear we felt was all too real. As dawn broke, we came to a decision. We would continue our search, but we would be more cautious, more prepared, and we would keep our newfound knowledge to ourselves, at least for now. Who would believe us if we started talking about skinwalkers and shapeshifters? Little did we know our encounter with the unknown was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next few weeks were tense. We continued our searches, but now every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every unexpected sound made us jump. The official search for Finn had been scaled back, with most people assuming he'd been the victim of a tragic animal attack. But Oren and I couldn't let it go. We started arming ourselves on our expeditions into the woods. Nothing too obvious. We didn't want to alarm anyone, but we always had knives, and sometimes Oren would bring his hunting rifle. It felt ridiculous at times, preparing to face a creature out of legend, but the memory of that night in the fog kept us vigilant. It was about 3 weeks after Finn's disappearance that I noticed the first changes. At first, they were subtle. My hearing seemed sharper, my sense of smell more acute. I could pick up scents I'd never noticed before, hear conversations from across the street. I chalked it up to heightened awareness from all the stress and lack of sleep. But as the days passed, the changes became more pronounced. My reflexes improved dramatically. At work, I caught a falling box of nails before I even realized I was moving. My strength increased too. Tasks that used to require effort now seemed effortless. I tried to hide it, to act normal, but I could tell Oren was starting to notice. He would give me odd looks when I reacted to a sound he couldn't hear, or when I lifted something heavy with ease. It all came to a head one night when we were out in the woods. We'd been searching a new area, following up on a reported sighting of a large animal. As we walked, I suddenly caught a scent, something musky and wild, unlike anything I'd smelled before. Without thinking, I turned towards it. "Eamon?" Oren's voice snapped me out of my focus. "What is it?" I blinked, realizing I'd stopped in my tracks. I'm not sure," I said, trying to gather my thoughts. "I thought I smelled something." Oren frowned. "I don't smell anything." I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Oren, something's happening to me. I can't explain it, but I'm changing." His frown deepened. "What do you mean changing?" So I told him about the enhanced senses, the increased strength and reflexes. As I spoke, I could see the worry in his eyes turn to something else. Fear. "When did this start?" he asked, his voice tight. I thought back, trying to pinpoint when I'd first noticed the changes, and then it hit me. "After that night," I said slowly. "After we found Finn's backpack. After whatever that thing was chased us." Oren's face paled. "Eamon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What if it bit you? What if this is how it spreads?" The implications of what he was saying hit me like a punch to the gut. Could it be possible? Could I be turning into one of those things? Before I could respond, a howl cut through the night, the same eerie, not quite animal sound we'd heard before. But this time, something inside me responded to it. I felt a pull, an urge to answer the call. Oren must have seen something in my face because he took a step back. "Eamon?" he said, his voice uncertain. I opened my mouth to reassure him, to tell him everything was fine. But what came out instead was a low growl that didn't sound human at all. Pain suddenly ripped through me, dropping me to my knees. It felt like my bones were reshaping themselves, like my skin was stretching. I could hear Oren calling my name, could see the horror on his face, but I couldn't respond. As the transformation took hold, my last coherent thought was a silent apology to my friend. Then the world dissolved into a haze of pain and primal instinct. When I came to, I was lying naked in a clearing, covered in dirt and leaves. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. As I sat up, memories of the night before came flooding back. The change, the hunt, the raw, animalistic pleasure of running through the woods on four legs. And Oren, oh God, Oren, what had I done? I staggered to my feet, my human mind reeling from the events of the night. I had to find Oren, had to make sure he was okay. But as I took a step, a new scent caught my attention. It was familiar, yet different. Oren's scent, but tinged with something wild and musky. With growing horror, I realized what it meant. I wasn't the only one who had changed last night. As I stood there trying to process this new reality, a twig snapped behind me. I turned to see Oren emerging from the trees, as naked and dirt-covered as I was. Our eyes met, and I saw in his the same mixture of horror, confusion, and primal excitement that I felt. "Eamon," he said, his voice hoarse. What are we?" I shook my head, unable to find the words. We were no longer just two friends searching for a missing person. We had become something else, something both more and less than human. As the gravity of our situation sank in, one thought crystallized in my mind. We had to find Finn, not just for his sake now, but for our own. Because if we could change like this, then maybe, just maybe, he could too. And so began the next phase of our hunt, not just for Finn, but for answers, for a cure, for some way to understand and control what we had become. Little did we know our transformation was just the beginning of a much larger, much more terrifying story. The weeks that followed our first transformation were a blur of confusion, fear, and a strange primal excitement. Oren and I struggled to come to terms with what we had become, while also trying to maintain some semblance of our normal lives. We quickly learned that the change was tied to the lunar cycle. As the full moon approached, we could feel the pull of our new nature growing stronger. The transformation itself was still painful, but each time it happened, it became a little easier, a little more natural. During these times, we would retreat deep into the woods, away from town and any chance of hurting someone. The wolf part of us reveled in the freedom, in the raw power of our new forms. We would run for hours, our heightened senses drinking in the world around us in a way we'd never experienced before. But with this newfound power came a terrible hunger. In our wolf forms, the urge to hunt, to kill, was almost overwhelming. We did our best to stick to deer and other wild game, but there were nights when the scent of human prey would drift to us on the wind, and it took every ounce of our willpower to resist. As humans, we threw ourselves into researching our condition. We scoured the internet for information on werewolves and skinwalkers, separating fact from fiction as best we could. We pored over old books of local legends looking for any clue that might help us understand what had happened to us. And always we searched for Finn. But now our search took on a new dimension. We weren't just looking for a missing person anymore. We were looking for one of our own kind. It was during one of these searches, about 2 months after our first change, that we encountered them. We were in our wolf forms, running through a part of the forest we hadn't explored before. Suddenly, a new scent hit us, musky, wild, but unmistakably similar to our own. We slowed our pace, moving cautiously through the underbrush. As we crested a small hill, we saw them, a pack of wolves, but not like any wolves we'd ever seen before. They were massive, easily twice the size of normal wolves, with an intelligence in their eyes that spoke of something more than animal. For a moment we all stood frozen, sizing each other up. Then the largest of them, a gray-furred beast with piercing yellow eyes, took a step forward. He let out a low growl that somehow formed words in our minds. "Who are you?" the voice growled. "Why do you trespass on our territory?" Oren and I exchanged glances, shocked at this new development. We hadn't known it was possible to communicate in our wolf forms. Hesitantly, I tried to form a response in my mind. We're new to this," I thought back. "We're looking for our friend. He disappeared a few months ago." The alpha's eyes narrowed. "A new one," he growled. "Yes, we felt the change, but he is not here. He has gone to the Dark One." A shiver ran through me at these words. The Dark One. It sounded ominous, foreboding. "Who is the Dark One?" I asked. The alpha bared his teeth in what might have been a grim smile. "The one who made us," he replied. "The one who rules us all." And so we learned the truth, or at least part of it. There were others like us, a whole pack of werewolves living in secret in the depths of the forest, and they answered to someone or something they called the Dark One. Over the next few hours, we learned more about our new reality than we had in months of searching on our own. The pack told us of the Dark One, a creature of immense power who had the ability to turn humans into werewolves with its bite. They spoke of a hierarchy among their kind, of territories and pack politics. But most importantly, they told us about Finn. He had indeed been turned just like us. But unlike us, he had embraced his new nature fully, giving himself over to the wildness within. He had joined the Dark One, becoming one of its most loyal followers. As the night wore on and the moon began to set, we felt the change coming upon us again. The Alpha noticed our discomfort. "You resist the change," he growled. "Why, it is who you are now." I didn't have an answer for him. How could I explain that we were still clinging to our humanity, still hoping to find a way back to our old lives? As we prepared to leave, the Alpha had one final message for us. "You cannot fight what you are," he said. "Sooner or later, you will have to choose the pack or the humans. You cannot live in both worlds forever." Those words haunted us as we made our way back to town, changing back to our human forms just as the sun began to rise. We had found some of the answers we were looking for, but they had only led to more questions. What was this Dark One? Why had it turned us? And most importantly, what had happened to Finn to make him embrace this new life so completely? As we walked back to Oren's house in silence, both lost in our own thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the precipice of something much larger and more dangerous than we had ever imagined. The quiet life I had known, the simple existence I had enjoyed, seemed like a distant memory now. We were part of a hidden world, a secret war between man and beast, and sooner or later, as the Alpha had said, we would have to choose a side. But for now, we had a new mission. We had to find Finn, had to try to bring him back from whatever dark path he had chosen. And perhaps in doing so, we could find a way to save ourselves as well. As we reached Oren's house, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I turned to my friend. "What do we do now?" I asked. Oren's face was grim, determined. "We find the Dark One," he said. "We find Finn, and we end this one way or another." I nodded, feeling a mix of fear and anticipation coursing through me. Our hunt was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The hunt for the Dark One consumed us. By day, we pored over maps, tracking the movements of the pack we'd encountered, trying to pinpoint the location of their leader. By night, we ran through the forest in our wolf forms, our senses alert for any sign of Finn or the mysterious being that controlled him. Our lives became a balancing act. We still had to maintain our human personas, show up for work, interact with friends and neighbors who had no idea of the secret we carried. But increasingly, it felt like a charade. The wolf inside us grew stronger with each passing day, and the pull of the wild was becoming harder to resist. It was Oren who first noticed the changes in the town. Subtle at first, an increase in missing pets, livestock found torn apart in the fields. Then people started to go missing, not many, and not often enough to cause panic, but enough to set the town on edge. We knew what it meant. The Dark One was expanding its territory, its influence creeping closer to civilization. We had to act, and soon. Our breakthrough came on a cold November night. We were in our wolf forms, running our usual patrol route, when a new scent caught our attention. It was similar to ours, but darker somehow, tinged with something ancient and malevolent. We followed the scent deep into a part of the forest we'd never explored before. The trees here were older, gnarled and twisted into unnatural shapes. An oppressive silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of our breathing. As we pushed through a thick patch of undergrowth, we found ourselves in a clearing. And there, in the center, stood a figure that made our blood run cold. It was vaguely humanoid, but larger than any man, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and wolf features, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce right through us. This, we knew without a doubt, was the Dark One. And standing beside it, his eyes gleaming with a feral light, was Finn. For a long moment we all stood frozen, sizing each other up. Then the Dark One spoke, its voice a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "So," it rumbled, "the new pups have finally found their way home." I felt a shudder run through me at its words. This wasn't home. This creature, this place, it was as far from home as I could imagine. Finn stepped forward, his lips curled back in a snarl. "You shouldn't have come here," he growled. But beneath the aggression, I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, regret. It was gone too quickly for me to be sure. Oren was the first to find his voice. "Finn," he thought, projecting his words as we'd learned to do. "What happened to you? Why are you doing this?" Finn's snarl deepened. "You don't understand," he snapped. "The power, the freedom, it's beyond anything you can imagine. Why would I ever want to go back to being human?" The Dark One chuckled, a sound like rocks grinding together. "You see," it said, "he has embraced his true nature, as you will in time." I felt a wave of revulsion wash over me. "Never," I growled. "We'll never join you." The Dark One's eyes narrowed. "You don't have a choice," it snarled. "You're mine. I made you. And sooner or later, you'll accept what you've become." With those words, it lunged forward with inhuman speed. Oren and I barely had time to react before it was upon us. We fought with every ounce of our newfound strength, our claws and teeth tearing at the Dark One's flesh. But it was like fighting a force of nature. No matter how much damage we inflicted, it kept coming. Finn joined the fray, his attacks focused on Oren. I could see the conflict in his eyes as he fought his former friend, but the Dark One's influence was too strong. They tumbled across the clearing, a blur of fur and fangs. I don't know how long the battle lasted. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish struggle. But gradually I began to realize we were losing. The Dark One was too strong, too ancient. We were tiring, our movements becoming slower, more desperate. Just as I thought all hope was lost, a howl pierced the night. It was answered by another, then another. Suddenly the clearing was filled with wolves, the pack we had met before. They threw themselves into the fight without hesitation, their combined strength turning the tide. The Dark One roared in fury, lashing out at everything within reach. In the chaos I saw Oren pinned beneath Finn, the latter's jaws inching towards his throat. With a burst of speed I didn't know I possessed, I tackled Finn, rolling with him across the forest floor. "Finn!" I shouted in my mind. "This isn't you! Fight it!" For a moment his eyes cleared. I saw recognition there, saw him struggling against the Dark One's control. Then his face contorted in pain, and he howled, a sound of pure anguish that cut through the noise of the battle. That howl seemed to break something in the air. The Dark One stumbled, its concentration broken. In that moment of weakness, the alpha of the pack saw his opportunity. He leapt, his powerful jaws clamping down on the Dark One's throat. What followed was a struggle of wills as much as of bodies. We all felt it, the psychic battle between the Alpha and the Dark One. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment I thought the Alpha would be overwhelmed. But then Oren was there, adding his strength to the Alpha's. I joined them, and then Finn, his eyes clear at last. One by one, the other wolves lent their power, until we were all connected, our combined will bearing down on the Dark One. With a final, terrible shriek, the Dark One's body began to dissolve, turning to a foul-smelling mist that dissipated in the night air. As it vanished, I felt something break inside me, a connection I hadn't even been aware of until it was gone. In the aftermath, we all stood panting, trying to process what had just happened. Finn collapsed to the ground, his body racked with sobs. Oren went to him, nuzzling him gently, offering what comfort he could. The Alpha approached us, his mental voice solemn. "It is done," he said. "The Dark One is no more. You have freed us all." As the adrenaline of the fight wore off, I began to notice changes. The constant pull of the wolf, the struggle to maintain my humanity, it was fading. I looked at Oren and Finn, saw the same realization dawning in their eyes. We were healing. Without the Dark One's influence, our bodies were slowly returning to their human state. The transformation back to human form was slow and painless, nothing like the violent changes we had experienced before. As the sun began to rise, we stood in the clearing, human, naked, and forever changed by our experience. The Alpha, still in his wolf form, regarded us with what seemed like respect. "You have a choice now," he said. "You can return to your human lives, or you can stay with us. The gift of the change is yours to keep or discard." I looked at Oren and Finn, saw the same mixture of relief and uncertainty on their faces that I felt. We had been through so much, seen things we could never unsee. Could we really go back to our old lives? In the end, we chose a middle path. We returned to town, resumed our human lives. But we kept the gift of the change, using it sparingly, respectfully. We became guardians of sorts, protecting the border between the human world and the wilderness. Finn struggled the most with the transition. The things he had done under the Dark One's influence haunted him. But with time and with our support, he began to heal. As for me, I never forgot that autumn when my simple life was turned upside down. The experiences changed me, made me appreciate the complexity of the world in a way I never had before. Sometimes on clear nights when the moon is full, I still feel the call of the wild. And sometimes I answer it, running through the forest with Oren and Finn by my side, feeling the boundless freedom of the wolf. But always, always we return to the world of humans, carrying our secret knowledge like a precious gift. The Dark One was gone, but its legacy lived on in us. We had faced the darkness, both outside and within ourselves, and we had survived. Whatever the future held, we would face it together. Not quite human, not quite wolf, but something in between. And in that in-between space we had found a new kind of peace. This happened in the 1990s. It was 1997, and I was up near Pictured Rocks, not far from Munising. My name's Vic Dillinger. I guess you could say I'm an acquired taste when it comes to people, which is why I take off to these remote places as often as I can. I'm not antisocial, but I find people tend to test my patience, and let's just say my patience has a short fuse. Anyway, I had rented a small cabin in the middle of nowhere, no cell service, no TV, and I loved it. I never thought a trip to Michigan's Upper Peninsula would be anything more than a quiet escape from my job, my life, and honestly, the people in both. I've always been more comfortable in the woods, not the touristy kind of woods. None of those manicured trails or campsites where people think they're roughing it with portable grills. No, I mean the deep, rugged kind, the kind of forest where your only neighbors are the sounds of wind through the trees, and whatever critters are out there doing their thing. Now I know the whole middle of nowhere bit might sound like I was asking for trouble, but I've been camping, hiking, and hunting my whole life. I'm no stranger to the outdoors, and I don't need anyone to tell me how to take care of myself out there. Heck, I've probably forgotten more about surviving in the woods than most people ever knew. But what happened out there wasn't something you could just prepare for. The drive up to the cabin was a journey in itself. As I left the bustling city of Detroit behind, the landscape gradually transformed. The flat urban sprawl gave way to gently rolling hills, which in turn became the dense primeval forests of the Upper Peninsula. The further north I drove, the more I felt the weight of civilization lifting from my shoulders. I remember the moment I crossed the Mackinac Bridge, that 5-mile stretch of engineering marvel connecting Michigan's two peninsulas. The view was breathtaking. The vast expanse of Lake Michigan on one side, Lake Huron on the other, and nothing but open sky above. It was like crossing a threshold into another world, one where the rules of society became less rigid, where nature still held sway. As I entered the Upper Peninsula, the transformation was complete. Gone were the strip malls and fast food joints that dotted the southern part of the state. Instead, I was surrounded by towering pines, their branches reaching out over the road like gnarled fingers. The air grew crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It filled my lungs, invigorating me, reminding me why I love these escapes so much. The cabin I had rented was tucked away off a dirt road, so far off the beaten path that I had to double-check my map several times to make sure I hadn't missed a turn. When I finally found it, I couldn't help but smile. It was perfect, a small, rustic structure made of rough-hewn logs, with a porch that faced the thick forest beyond. It looked like something out of a postcard, the kind of place where time stood still. As I unpacked my truck, I took in my surroundings. The cabin sat in a small clearing, but beyond that, the forest pressed in from all sides. Massive pines towered overhead, their branches creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The air was filled with the chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchenette occupied one corner with a wood-burning stove for heat and cooking. A sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the main room, and a comfortable-looking bed was tucked into the far corner. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with well-worn paperbacks, mostly wilderness survival guides and local history books. It was spare, but it had everything I needed. That first night, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set through the trees, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The stress of my job, the constant noise of the city, the endless demands of modern life, all of it seemed to melt away, replaced by the gentle whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a loon on some hidden lake. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the crisp, pine-scented air. This, I thought, is what I've been missing. This is what I needed. Little did I know that this peaceful retreat was about to turn into something far more sinister, something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and my place in it. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared and the forest plunged into darkness, I headed inside, looking forward to a good night's sleep. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and the absolute silence of the woods was a balm to my city-worn nerves. I drifted off quickly, my dreams filled with the promise of days spent hiking, fishing, and simply existing in this pristine wilderness. But sometime in the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first I couldn't place it, a sort of low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining my ears to catch it again. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest at night. I told myself it was probably just a dream, or maybe a bear wandering too close to the cabin. But as I lay back down, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness was watching, waiting. It was a feeling that would only grow stronger in the days to come. The next few days passed in a blur of peaceful activities. I hiked through the dense forest, marveling at the ancient trees and the untouched beauty of the landscape. I fished in a nearby stream, the cool water rushing around my legs as I cast my line into the crystal-clear pools. I even tried my hand at identifying some of the local flora, using one of the guidebooks I'd found on the cabin's bookshelf. But despite the idyllic surroundings, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me since that first night. It was like a constant itch at the back of my mind, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, scanning the tree line for... what? I didn't know, but the feeling persisted. It was on the 4th day that things really started to get weird. I had spent the morning fishing and was heading back to the cabin with a string of trout for dinner. As I approached the clearing, I noticed something odd about the cabin's porch. From a distance, it looked like someone had scattered a pile of sticks or branches across it. But as I got closer, my blood ran cold. They weren't sticks, they were bones. Dozens of them, bleached white by the sun, scattered across the porch like some macabre welcome mat. Most looked like they came from small animals, rabbits, squirrels, maybe a fox or two. But there were larger ones as well, and I didn't want to think too hard about what they might have come from. I approached cautiously, my eyes darting around the clearing, half expecting to see whatever had left this grisly offering lurking at the forest's edge. But there was nothing, just the usual sounds of birds and wind in the trees. With shaking hands, I began to clear away the bones, tossing them into the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. As I worked, I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a pack of wolves had made a kill nearby and dragged some of the remains here. Or perhaps a bear had been scavenging and decided to have a snack on my porch. But even as I thought it, I knew these explanations rang hollow. There was something deliberate about the arrangement, something that spoke of intelligence rather than animal instinct. Once the porch was clear, I went inside and double-checked all the locks on the windows and doors. Not that they would do much good against whatever was out there, but it made me feel a little better. I spent the rest of the day inside, jumping at every creak of the cabin's old timbers, every rustle of wind outside. As night fell, my unease grew. The darkness seemed to press in on the cabin from all sides, and I found myself imagining all sorts of horrors lurking just beyond the reach of the light from my lantern. I tried to distract myself by reading, but I couldn't focus on the words. They seemed to swim on the page, rearranging themselves into warnings and threats. It was close to midnight when I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It started as a low moan, almost too quiet to hear. But it grew louder, rising in pitch until it became a keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. Something wrong. The sound went on for what felt like hours, rising and falling in intensity, sometimes so loud it made the windows rattle, other times fading to a whisper that had me straining my ears to catch it. And underneath it all was that same rumbling growl I'd heard that first night, a constant undercurrent of menace. I don't know when it finally stopped. I must have fallen into an exhausted sleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows and birds were chirping outside as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I could feel it in the air, in the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. And when I finally worked up the courage to step outside, I saw the proof written in the dirt around the cabin. Tracks, hundreds of them, circling the cabin, crossing and recrossing each other in a dizzying pattern. They were like the ones I'd seen before. Too big for a wolf, too strange for a bear. But now there were more details visible in the soft earth. I could see the imprint of massive claws, easily as long as my hand. And in some of the deeper prints there was a strange, almost oily residue that made my skin crawl just looking at it. I spent the morning examining the tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the more I looked, the less sense it made. The prints seemed to change as they circled the cabin, starting out almost wolf-like but becoming more and more distorted, as if whatever had made them was constantly shifting and changing shape. And then there were the trees. I hadn't noticed it at first, but as I followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, I saw deep gouges in the bark of several pines. They were claw marks, but not like any I'd ever seen. They spiraled up the trunks, some reaching as high as 20 or 30 feet. Whatever had made them was not only huge, but capable of climbing with terrifying ease. As I stood there staring at those scarred trees, a thought struck me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't dealing with some unknown animal here. This was something else entirely, something that defied explanation. And I was alone out here, miles from help, with no way to call for assistance even if I wanted to. For the first time since I'd arrived, I seriously considered leaving. I could pack up my things, get in my truck, and be back in civilization before nightfall. But something held me back. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was a morbid curiosity to see this through to the end. Whatever it was, I decided to stay, at least for now. But I wasn't going to just sit around waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I gathered all the food in the cabin into one easily defendable spot. I sharpened my hunting knife and fashioned a makeshift spear out of a broom handle and a kitchen knife. I even found some old cans in a cupboard and strung them up around the porch, an early warning system in case anything tried to approach in the night. As the sun began to set, I settled in for what I knew would be a long night. I had no idea what was coming, but I was determined to face it head on. Whatever was out there in the darkness, whatever had been toying with me these past few days, I was ready for it, or so I thought. The night started quietly enough. I sat in the main room of the cabin, my makeshift weapons close at hand, watching the shadows lengthen outside the windows. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with its usual nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But underlying it all was a tension, a sense of wrongness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I don't know exactly when things changed. Maybe I dozed off for a moment, or maybe I was just too focused on the sounds outside. But suddenly I became aware of a presence in the room with me. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything move. I just knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that I was no longer alone. Slowly, trying to control my breathing, I turned my head towards the darkest corner of the room. At first I saw nothing. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a shape. It was like a patch of darkness had somehow become deeper, more substantial. And then I saw the eyes. They were yellow, glowing faintly in the dim light, and they were fixed directly on me. They weren't animal eyes, at least not any animal I'd ever seen. There was an intelligence there, a malevolence that sent chills down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I was frozen, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. And then, ever so slowly, the thing in the corner began to move. It unfolded itself from the shadows, rising up and up until it nearly touched the ceiling. In the dim light, I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape, but twisted, wrong. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible ways. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to shift and ripple, sometimes appearing furry, sometimes scaly, never settling on one form. But it was the face that truly horrified me. It was like someone had taken features from a dozen different animals and mashed them together without rhyme or reason. A wolf's snout filled with teeth too large and sharp to be natural, eyes that were sometimes human, sometimes feline, sometimes something else entirely, and antlers, massive twisted things that scraped the ceiling as the creature moved. I knew I should run, should fight, should do something, but I was paralyzed, caught in the gaze of those impossible eyes. And then it spoke. The sound that came from its mouth, if you could call that gash filled with needle-sharp teeth a mouth, was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was a cacophony of growls, whispers, and screeches, all layered over each other in a way that made my head spin. But somehow, impossibly, I understood it. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice reverberating in my skull. "This is our place, our hunting ground. You are prey." Finally, driven by sheer terror, I managed to move. I scrambled backwards, nearly falling over my chair in my haste to put distance between myself and the monstrosity before me. My hand closed around the makeshift spear I'd created earlier, and I brandished it in front of me like a talisman. The thing, I couldn't bring myself to think of it as a creature or an animal, it was too alien for that, seemed amused by my feeble attempt at defense. It cocked its head to one side, an almost curious gesture that would have been comical if it wasn't so terrifying. "You think you can fight us?" it asked, and I swear I could hear laughter in its impossible voice. "We are the forest, we are the night, we are hunger given form." As it spoke, its shape began to change again. The antlers receded into its skull, only to be replaced by a mass of writhing tentacles. Its arms elongated, fingers extending into wicked claws. And all the while, those eyes never left mine, boring into me with an intensity that made me feel like my very soul was being laid bare. I knew then that I was going to die. Whatever this thing was, whatever impossible horror I had stumbled upon, it was going to kill me, and there was nothing I could do about it. But some part of me, some stubborn core that refused to go quietly, rebelled against that thought. With a yell that was equal parts terror and defiance, I lunged forward with my makeshift spear. I expected the thing to dodge, to bat the weapon aside with contemptuous ease. But to my shock, the sharpened end sank into its flesh with a sickening squelch. The thing let out a screech that threatened to burst my eardrums. It reared back, tentacles writhing, claws slashing at the air. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the night. The forest was alive with sound and movement. Shadows flitted between the trees, always just at the edge of my vision. Howls and screams echoed from every direction, a symphony of horror that threatened to drive me mad. But I kept running, driven by a terror so profound it overrode every other thought or sensation. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to find safety, had to escape this nightmare. I stumbled through the dark forest, branches whipping at my face and roots threatening to trip me with every step. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind me, a cacophony of howls, screeches, and that terrible, impossible voice. "You cannot escape us," it seemed to say, the words carried on the wind itself. "We are everywhere." My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. The moon, when it occasionally broke through the canopy, cast twisted shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet disappeared. I had been so focused on what was behind me that I hadn't seen the ravine until it was too late. I tumbled down the steep slope, bouncing off rocks and fallen logs, until I splashed into the icy waters of a creek at the bottom. The shock of the cold water brought me back to my senses. I dragged myself to the bank, every part of my body screaming in pain. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized the sounds of pursuit had stopped. The forest was eerily silent. I forced myself to my feet, wincing at the pain in my ribs, probably bruised, if not broken. In the dim moonlight, I could make out the creek stretching away in both directions. With no better plan, I decided to follow it downstream, hoping it would lead me to a road or a town. As I slogged through the shallow water, trying to minimize my trail, my mind raced. What was that thing back at the cabin? How could something like that exist? And if it was real, what did that mean for everything I thought I knew about the world? Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this nightmare forest. The creek gradually widened into a proper river, and I began to hear a low rumble in the distance. As I rounded a bend, I saw the source, a waterfall, dropping away into darkness. I approached the edge cautiously. The fall wasn't enormous, maybe 30 feet, but in my battered state it might as well have been 1,000. I was about to turn back, to try to find another way, when I heard it again. That bone-chilling howl, closer now. They had found my trail. With no other choice, I took a deep breath and jumped. The impact drove what little air remained from my lungs. I flailed in the churning water at the base of the falls, struggling to find the surface. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, my head broke into the air. I gasped, coughing and sputtering. As I treaded water, trying to get my bearings, a sound caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just the roar of the waterfall. But no, there was a rhythm to it, a mechanical quality that didn't belong in this primal wilderness. Traffic. I was hearing traffic. With renewed energy, I swam to the shore and dragged myself out of the water. I could see lights in the distance, breaking through the trees. Civilization, safety. I stumbled towards those lights, my body on the verge of collapse. Each step was agony, but the promise of rescue drove me on. Finally, I broke through the tree line and found myself on the shoulder of a highway. A car approached, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. I waved my arms frantically, praying they would stop. To my immense relief, the car slowed and pulled over. An older couple peered out at me, their faces a mix of concern and wariness. I must have been quite a sight. Soaking wet, covered in cuts and bruises, wild-eyed with terror. "Are you all right, son?" the man asked, rolling down his window slightly. I opened my mouth to respond, to pour out my story of terror and impossibility. But how could I explain what had happened? Who would believe me? I got lost, I managed to croak out. Took a bad fall. Can you take me to the nearest town? They exchanged a look, then nodded. "Hop in the back," the woman said. "We'll get you to a hospital." As we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the forest. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving among the trees, a shape too large and wrong to be natural. But then we rounded a bend, and the forest was lost from view. I slumped in the back seat, exhaustion finally overtaking me. But even as I drifted into unconsciousness, I knew that this wasn't over. Whatever I had encountered in those woods, whatever impossible horror lurked in the deep forests of the Upper Peninsula, it wasn't going to let me go so easily. This was just the beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital rooms and police interviews. My body was a canvas of cuts, bruises, and sprains, with 2 cracked ribs thrown in for good measure. The doctors marveled at my condition, wondering aloud how I had managed to walk out of the forest at all. The police were less impressed. They listened to my sanitized version of events. I had gotten lost, fallen down a ravine, and somehow made my way to the highway, with thinly veiled skepticism. I could tell they thought I was holding something back, but without evidence of foul play, there wasn't much they could do. I was informed that a search party had been sent to the cabin I had rented, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a struggle, no strange tracks, nothing to corroborate my story of terror in the night. The bones I had found on the porch, gone without a trace. The claw marks on the trees, if they had ever existed, They had vanished as completely as morning mist in the sun. Part of me wanted to insist, to make them understand the horror of what I had experienced. But a larger part, the part that still quailed at the memory of those yellow eyes and that impossible shifting form, kept me silent. Who would believe me? And more importantly, what if telling my story brought the attention of that thing back to me? So I nodded along with their assumptions, signed the paperwork, and checked myself out of the hospital as soon as I was physically able. But even as I boarded a bus back to Detroit, I knew that running away wouldn't be enough. The encounter in the forest had changed me, opened my eyes to a world I never knew existed, and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to my normal life. I went back to work, hung out with friends, did all the things I used to do, but it all felt hollow somehow. The mundane concerns of everyday life seemed trivial in the face of what I now knew lurked in the shadows of the world. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted face, heard that impossible voice. I started jumping at shadows, convinced that every dark corner held some writhing horror waiting to pounce. My friends noticed the change in me, but I brushed off their concerns. How could I explain what was happening to me when I barely understood it myself? I threw myself into research, spending long hours in libraries and on obscure corners of the internet, looking for any information about what I had encountered. Most of what I found was useless, crackpot theories and badly photoshopped pictures. But every now and then, I'd come across something that made my blood run cold. An old newspaper article about a series of disappearances in the Upper Peninsula in the 1950s, all centered around the same area where I had rented that cabin. A forum post describing an encounter with a shape-shifting creature in the forests of northern Wisconsin, the details eerily similar to my own experience, a centuries-old Ojibwe legend about malevolent spirits that could take on the form of animals or men. Slowly, a picture began to form, fragmentary and terrifying. Whatever I had encountered wasn't unique. It, or things like it, had been haunting the forests of the northern Midwest for centuries. The natives had known about them, had warnings and rituals to keep them at bay. But as their culture was eroded and their knowledge lost, the things in the forest had grown bolder. But knowledge, I was learning, was a double-edged sword. The more I discovered, the more I realized how little I truly understood. And worse, I began to suspect that my research wasn't going unnoticed. It started small. I'd come home to find things slightly out of place, as if someone had been in my apartment. My computer would be running when I was sure I had turned it off. I'd wake up in the night to the sound of scratching at my windows, only to find nothing there when I looked. And then the dreams started, vivid, terrifying visions of running through endless forests, always pursued by something I couldn't quite see. I'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the echo of that alien voice ringing in my ears. "You cannot escape us. We are everywhere." I knew I was losing my grip on reality. My work suffered, my relationships crumbled. I started carrying weapons, my old hunting knife, a can of bear spray, even a small pistol I acquired through less than legal means. I knew they would be useless if that thing ever came for me again, but their weight was reassuring nonetheless. It all came to a head about 6 months after my experience in the woods. I was walking home late one night, the streets empty and silent. As I passed an alley, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, a low, rumbling growl that I had hoped never to hear again. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just ran as fast as I could. But with every pounding step, every gasping breath, I knew it was useless. You can't outrun a nightmare. I don't know how long I ran or how far. But eventually I found myself in a small park, the kind with a few trees and a playground, an oasis of nature in the urban sprawl. I collapsed onto a bench, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. And then I saw it, emerging from the shadows between two trees, its form shifting and changing with every step. One moment it was almost human, the next a twisted parody of a wolf, then something else entirely, something my mind couldn't even begin to comprehend. But the eyes, those terrible ancient eyes, remained the same. They fixed on me with a hunger that was all too familiar. "Did you think you could hide from us?" that impossible voice asked, echoing in my head. "Did you think you could escape?" I wanted to run, I wanted to fight, I wanted to scream, but I was frozen, caught once again in the gaze of those yellow eyes. The thing moved closer, its form continuing to shift and change. Claws became tentacles, became fur, became scales, a dizzying display of impossible transformations. And all the while those eyes never left mine. "You have seen," it said, "you have known, and now you will join us." As it reached for me with appendages that were neither arms nor claws, nor anything that should exist in this world, I realized a terrible truth. This wasn't an ending. This was a beginning. Whatever happened next, whatever this thing did to me, it wouldn't be the end of my story. It would be the start of a new one. As those impossible limbs wrapped around me, as that alien consciousness began to seep into my mind, I had one last coherent thought. I should have stayed in the city. I should never have gone into those woods, but it was too late now. Far, far too late. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally came to, I was back in the forest. But it wasn't the same forest I had fled from months ago. This place was older, darker, more primeval. The trees towered impossibly high, their branches weaving together to form a canopy so thick that barely any light penetrated to the forest floor. I tried to move, to stand up, but my body felt wrong. My limbs were too long, joints bending in ways they shouldn't. When I looked down at myself, I nearly screamed. My skin was shifting, rippling like the surface of a pond in a strong wind. One moment it was covered in fur, the next in scales, then something else entirely that I had no words to describe. "Welcome," said a voice, and I recognized it as the same one that had haunted my nightmares for months. I looked up to see the creature, or was it creatures, surrounding me. They were like the one I had encountered before, but also different. Each one was unique, a nightmare collage of animal and human features mixed with things that had no place in the natural world. What have you done to me?" I tried to ask, but the words came out as a garbled mix of growls and chittering sounds. "We have freed you," the voice said, seeming to come from all of them at once. "You are becoming what you were always meant to be." Over the next hours, days, time had no meaning in this place. But over what felt like an eternity, I learned. I learned to control my new form, to shift and change at will. I learned to move through the forest like a shadow, to climb trees with impossible ease, to swim through the deepest lakes without needing to breathe. And I learned about them, about us. We were ancient, older than humanity, older than the forests themselves. We were the original inhabitants of this land, pushed to the fringes by the encroachment of civilization. But we were patient. We could wait. And now, we were reclaiming what was ours. At first, I resisted. I clung to my humanity, to my memories of who I had been. But as time passed, those memories began to fade. The concerns of my old life seemed trivial, meaningless in the face of the vast, timeless existence I now experienced. I began to hunt with the others. At first, it was animals, deer, bear, the occasional wolf. But soon we turned our attention to more interesting prey. Hikers who strayed too far from the marked trails. Campers who thought they were safe in their tents. The occasional ranger or search party who came looking for the missing. I should have been horrified. The old me would have been. But now it was simply the natural order of things. We were the apex predators and everything else was prey. Years passed. The forest grew and changed around us. I watched as the seasons cycled, as saplings grew into mighty trees, as streams carved new paths through the landscape. And all the while we hunted, we waited, we grew stronger. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of the outside world, scraps of newspapers carried on the wind, snatches of radio broadcasts from a ranger's truck. The world was changing out there, new technologies, new conflicts, new fears. But here in the deep woods, time stood still. Occasionally we would venture out to the edges of our domain. We would leave signs of our presence. A scattering of bones on a cabin porch, claw marks high up on tree trunks. Little reminders to the humans that they were not as safe as they thought they were. That there were still wild places in the world where they were not the masters. And sometimes when the mood struck us, we would choose one. Not to hunt, not to kill, but to change. Like I had been changed. We would stalk them, terrify them, chase them to the brink of madness. And then, when they were at their most vulnerable, We would offer them a choice, to join us or to die. Most chose death, but some, a precious few, embraced the change. They became part of us, adding their own unique nightmares to our collective form. I don't know how long it's been now since that night in the park when I was taken. Time has little meaning for beings like us. But I know that the world out there is very different from the one I left behind. New cities have risen, old ones have fallen. The climate has shifted, changing the very nature of the forests we call home. But we remain, we adapt, we endure. And on nights when the moon is full and the wind carries the scent of fear from some distant campsite, I remember. I remember the man I used to be, the life I used to have. I remember the terror I felt when I first encountered the things in the woods, and I smile, a terrible smile full of teeth too sharp to be human, as I set out to create that same terror in others. For I am no longer the prey. I am the predator. I am the thing that haunts the shadows. I am the nightmare that waits in the deep, dark woods. And if you're reading this, wondering if it's safe to go camping in that remote spot you've heard about, wondering if the shadows really do move when you're not looking, wondering if that sound you heard was just the wind or something more, well, there's really only one way to find out, isn't there? The deep woods are calling. Will you answer? Just remember, we'll be waiting. As the years stretched into decades, I found myself growing restless. The endless cycle of hunting and terrorizing lost its thrill. The forest, once a realm of infinite mystery, began to feel confining. I started to question my place in this timeless existence. One night, as we gathered around the twisted remains of an old oak tree struck by lightning, I voiced my doubts. Is this all there is? I asked, my voice a dissonant chorus of growls and whispers. Are we destined to simply exist in these woods forever, feeding on fear and flesh? The others turned to me, their ever-shifting form seeming to bristle with displeasure. The eldest among us, a being so ancient that parts of its form had begun to fossilize, fixed me with a gaze that seemed to pierce through time itself. You still cling to your human past, it said, its voice like grinding stone. You think in terms of purpose and destiny. We simply are. That is enough. But it wasn't enough. Not for me. The human part of me, the part I thought had been lost in the transformation, began to reassert itself. I started to remember more clearly the man I had been, the life I had left behind. And with those memories came a gnawing sense of guilt for the atrocities I had committed in the intervening years. I began to separate myself from the others, spending long periods alone in the deepest parts of the forest. I tried to reconnect with my humanity, to find some shred of the person I used to be. It was a painful process, like trying to fit back into a skin I had long outgrown. The others noticed my withdrawal. At first, they seemed merely curious, then concerned. But as time passed and I continued to distance myself, their attitude changed to one of suspicion and hostility. You cannot go back, they would whisper as I passed. You are one of us now, forever. But I was determined to try. I began to push the boundaries of our territory, venturing closer to the edges of civilization than I had in years. I watched the humans from afar, studying their movements, their interactions. I listened to their conversations, picked through their discarded possessions. Slowly, painfully, I began to remember what it was like to be one of them. It was during one of these excursions that I encountered her. A young woman, a wildlife biologist conducting research in the forest. She had strayed further from the marked trails than most, her curiosity and scientific interest overriding her caution. I watched her for days, fascinated by her methodical approach, her careful observations of the forest life. She seemed to sense the wrongness in the deep woods, the unnatural silence that fell whenever we passed nearby. But instead of fleeing like most humans would, she leaned into it, driven by a need to understand. It was her courage, her thirst for knowledge, that finally broke through the last of my monstrous shell. One night, as she sat by her campfire reviewing her notes, I approached her. Not in my full, terrifying form, but as close to human as I could manage. She was startled at first, of course. A strange man appearing out of the darkness would be alarming in any circumstance, let alone in the middle of a remote forest. But as we talked, her fear gave way to curiosity. I couldn't tell her everything, of course. The full truth would have shattered her sanity. But I hinted at things, at the true nature of the forest and its inhabitants. To my surprise, she believed me, or at least she was willing to consider the possibility that there were things in this world beyond current scientific understanding. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn to her campsite again and again. We talked for hours about the forest, about her research, about the world beyond. Slowly, hesitantly, I began to remember what it was like to connect with another person, to feel something other than hunger or the thrill of the hunt. But my actions had not gone unnoticed. The others were watching, waiting. They saw my interactions with the human as a betrayal, a rejection of everything we were. And they were determined to put an end to it. It happened on a moonless night. I was making my way back to the deep woods after spending the evening talking with the biologist. Suddenly, the forest around me came alive with movement. My former companions emerged from the shadows, their forms more horrific than I had ever seen them. "You have forgotten what you are," their voices echoed in my mind. "You have forgotten your place. We cannot allow this to continue." I tried to reason with them, to explain that there could be more to our existence than endless hunting and terror. But they were beyond reason. To them, I was a threat, a cancer that needed to be cut out. The battle that followed was like nothing I had experienced before. We clashed in a whirlwind of teeth, claws, and impossible flesh. Trees were uprooted. The ground itself seemed to heave and split. Our inhuman shrieks echoed through the forest, sending every living thing for miles fleeing in terror. I fought with everything I had, drawing on both my monstrous strength and my reawakened human cunning. But they were many, and I was one. Slowly, inevitably, they began to overwhelm me. As I felt myself being torn apart, my consciousness scattered to the winds, I had one last, desperate thought. With the last of my strength, I reached out across the forest, seeking the mind of the biologist. I couldn't save myself, but maybe, just maybe, I could warn her. Give her a chance to escape, to tell the world what lurked in the deep woods. I felt my message reach her, saw through her eyes as she awoke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. I pushed into her mind images of the horrors that were coming, urged her to run, to never look back. As my former companions closed in for the final blow, I saw through the biologist's eyes as she scrambled to pack up her camp. I felt her terror, her confusion, but also her determination to survive, to understand. My last thought, as my consciousness finally fractured and faded, was a mix of regret and hope. Regret for the lives I had taken, the terror I had spread. But hope, too. Hope that the biologist would make it out alive. Hope that she would tell our story. Hope that someday someone would find a way to end the cycle of horror that had consumed me and so many others. As the deep woods claimed me for the final time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Whatever came next, my long nightmare was finally over. But for those still living, for those who might venture into the dark heart of the forest, the nightmare was just beginning. The things in the woods were angry now, roused to a fury that hadn't been seen in centuries. They would not rest until they had reclaimed their territory, until every human who dared to enter their domain had been consumed or converted. So if you're reading this, if you're thinking of taking that camping trip, of exploring that uncharted wilderness, remember, the deep woods are watching, they are waiting, and they are hungry. Be careful out there. Be very, very careful. The biologist, Dr. Laura Chen, stumbled out of the forest 3 days later, her clothes torn, her body covered in scratches, her eyes wild with a mix of terror and determination. She clutched her research notes and a small, battered camera to her chest, as if they were the most precious things in the world. At first, no one believed her stories of shape-shifting monsters and ancient malevolent forces lurking in the deep woods. Her colleagues dismissed her claims as the ravings of someone suffering from exhaustion and isolation. The local authorities, while concerned about her condition, found no evidence to support her wild tales. But Laura was nothing if not persistent. She pored over her notes, analyzed her photographs, and compiled every scrap of data she had collected during her time in the forest. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, one that defied conventional scientific understanding but couldn't be easily dismissed. Her photographs, while blurry and often taken in low light, showed glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. Massive claw marks high up on tree trunks, footprints that seemed to shift and change between images, and in one, barely visible in the background, a shape that could not be explained as any known animal. Laura's research led her down strange paths. She delved into folklore and mythology, finding echoes of the forest creatures in ancient stories from cultures around the world. She studied anomalous phenomena, looking for patterns that might explain what she had encountered. And all the while, she felt watched, as if something from the forest had followed her back to civilization. Years passed. Laura's obsession with the forest and its inhabitants cost her her academic career, her relationships, nearly her sanity. But she never gave up. She self-published her findings, spoke at fringe science conferences, and maintained a blog detailing her ongoing research. And slowly, very slowly, people began to listen. It started with a few missing hikers in the area where Laura had conducted her research. Nothing unusual at first. The deep woods could be dangerous for the unprepared. But as the numbers grew and the disappearances became stranger, whole camping groups vanishing without a trace, experienced outdoorsmen going missing in areas they knew like the back of their hand, people started to take notice. Laura's blog gained followers. Her self-published book, once dismissed as the ravings of a crackpot, began to sell. And then, 10 years after her experience in the forest, something happened that changed everything. A group of teenage campers out for a weekend of fun managed to capture something on video. The footage was shaky, clearly taken by someone running in terror, but for a few brief seconds it showed something impossible. A creature larger than a bear, its form seeming to shift and change even as the camera recorded it. And its eyes, yellow, glowing, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal. The video went viral. Experts analyzed it frame by frame, looking for signs of a hoax. But while many dismissed it as an elaborate fake, others weren't so sure. And for those who had experienced the deep woods themselves, who had felt that sense of being watched by something ancient and hungry, the video confirmed their worst fears. Suddenly, Laura found herself in demand. News shows wanted to interview her. Documentary filmmakers sought her expertise. Even some mainstream scientists, intrigued by the video and the growing number of unexplained phenomena, began to take her research seriously. But with attention came danger. As Laura's story spread, others began to come forward with their own tales of encounters in the deep woods, and not all of them survived the telling. Some disappeared shortly after sharing their stories. Others died in strange accidents, their bodies found mangled in ways that defied explanation. Laura knew she was at risk. The things in the woods, her mind shied away from calling them monsters, though she knew that's what they were, didn't want their existence revealed. She installed security systems in her home, varied her routines, always looked over her shoulder. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they came for her. When the attack finally came, it wasn't what she expected. She awoke one night to find a figure standing at the foot of her bed. For a moment, her heart raced in terror. But then she recognized him, the strange man from the forest, the one who had warned her, who had helped her escape. But he wasn't a man, not really. His form shifted and changed as she watched, never settling on one shape for more than a moment. And his eyes, those ancient, inhuman eyes, held a sadness that seemed to span centuries. "You've done well," he said, his voice a symphony of impossible sounds. "But it's not enough. They're coming, not just for you, but for all of humanity. The balance has shifted. The old agreements have been broken." Laura sat up, her fear replaced by a burning curiosity. "What agreements? What are you talking about?" The being that had once been a man sighed, a sound like wind through ancient trees. "There was a time when we lived in balance with humans. We kept to the deep woods, they stayed to the edges. But now, with your cities growing, your technology spreading, that balance has been destroyed. The others, they see only one solution: to reclaim what was once ours, to drive humanity back, to restore the old ways." "But you disagree," Laura said, understanding dawning. "That's why you helped me, why you're here now." He nodded, his form rippling with the motion. "There can be a new balance, but it will not be easy. The others, they are set in their ways. They see humanity as a threat or as prey. They will not stop until they are forced to." "How?" Laura asked. How can we stop them? The being's form seemed to solidify slightly, becoming more human-like. Knowledge, understanding. The more humans know about us, the less power we have over them. Fear is our greatest weapon, but it's also our greatest weakness. If humanity faces us without fear, if they understand what we are and where we come from, we become less. Laura's mind raced with the implications. So my research, my book, the video, it's all been helping? Yes, the being said, but it's not enough. The others are moving faster now, spreading beyond the deep woods. They're adapting, finding new ways to hunt, new forms to take. You need to warn people, to prepare them. But how? Laura asked. Even with the video, most people still don't believe. How can I make them understand the danger? The being's form began to fade, becoming translucent. You have the knowledge, you have the evidence. Now you need to find the right people to listen. There are others out there like you, who have seen, who know. Find them, unite them, create a network to share information, to track our movements, to warn those who might become our prey. As he spoke, images flashed through Laura's mind, faces of people she had never met but somehow knew were important. Locations around the world where the barriers between realities were thin, ancient symbols that held power over beings like him. It won't be easy, the being said, his voice fading along with his form. The others will fight you every step of the way, but it's the only chance humanity has, the only chance for a new balance. And then he was gone, leaving Laura alone in her bedroom, her mind reeling with new knowledge and a sense of urgency she had never felt before. She knew what she had to do. It wouldn't be easy, and it would likely put her in even more danger than she was already in. But the fate of humanity, of both humanity and the beings in the woods, depended on her next moves. Laura got out of bed and went to her computer. She had calls to make, emails to send, plans to set in motion. The real work, she realized, was just beginning. As she worked through the night, she could feel eyes watching her from the shadows. But for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to fight for a future where humans and the things in the deep woods could coexist. The battle for the future of both species had begun, and Laura Chen was on the front lines. Over the next few years, Laura's work took on a new urgency. She traveled the world, seeking out others who had encountered the forest beings. She built a network of researchers, witnesses, and believers, all working together to understand and document the growing threat. But for every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back. Members of her network would disappear without a trace. Research facilities were destroyed in freak accidents. And always, there was the sense of being watched, of something vast and ancient stirring in the shadows of the world. Despite the setbacks, Laura and her team made progress. They developed new technologies to detect the presence of the forest beings, created protocols for safely exploring areas where the creatures were known to hunt, and worked on ways to communicate with the more benevolent members of the species. As their understanding grew, so did the complexity of the situation. They discovered that the forest beings weren't a monolithic group, but a diverse collection of entities with their own factions and internal conflicts. Some, like the being that had helped Laura, wanted to find a way to coexist with humanity. Others were bent on domination or destruction. The turning point came 5 years after Laura's midnight visitation. A small town in northern Canada was overrun by the forest beings, its population either killed or transformed. But this time there were survivors who managed to capture irrefutable evidence of what had happened. The world could no longer deny the truth. The existence of the forest beings became public knowledge, sending shockwaves through every level of society. Governments scrambled to respond, religious institutions grappled with the implications, and ordinary people were forced to confront a reality that defied everything they thought they knew about the world. In the chaos that followed, Laura and her network became the voice of reason and experience. They shared their knowledge, advised on defense strategies, and worked to bridge the gap between humanity and those forest beings who were willing to communicate. It wasn't an easy road. There were battles, both physical and ideological. The more aggressive forest beings launched attacks around the world, while fearmongers among the human population called for the eradication of all the creatures, peaceful or not. But slowly, painfully, a new balance began to emerge. Protected areas were established where the forest beings could live undisturbed. Research into their origins and abilities led to breakthroughs in science and technology. And a few brave humans even began to learn the art of shapeshifting, becoming ambassadors between the two species. 20 years after her first terrifying encounter in the woods, Laura stood at the edge of a vast forest preserve. Behind her, a city skyline rose into the clouds, a testament to human resilience and adaptability. Before her, the deep woods stretched to the horizon, still mysterious, still dangerous, but no longer unknown. As she watched, a shape emerged from the trees. It was the being who had once been a man, the one who had set her on this path so long ago. He smiled, his form shifting between human and something gloriously other. "You've done well," he said, his voice carrying the whisper of wind through leaves and the rumble of the earth itself. "A new age has begun." Laura nodded, feeling the weight of the years and the battles fought. "It's not perfect," she said. "There's still so much fear, so much misunderstanding on both sides." "Perfect?" The being laughed, the sound like music and thunder combined. "No, it's not perfect, but it's a beginning, a chance for both our kinds to grow, to learn, to become more than we were." As if to emphasize his point, a group of human researchers emerged from the woods behind him, chatting excitedly about their latest discoveries. At the same time, a military patrol passed by on the human side of the boundary, a reminder that not all dangers had passed. "There will always be challenges," the being said, his form rippling in the sunlight. "Always be those who fear change, who cling to the old ways. But now there is hope. Now there is a chance for understanding." Laura smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in decades. "Yes," she said, "there is hope." As she turned to leave to return to her work and the endless tasks that came with bridging two worlds, she paused. "You know," she said to the being, "I never did learn your name." The being's form shifted, becoming for a moment the man he had once been. "Victor," he said, his voice briefly, startlingly human. "My name was Victor." Laura nodded, understanding the gift he had given her. "Thank you, Victor," she said, "for everything." As she walked away, she heard the rustle of leaves and the soft padding of feet returning to the deep woods. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The future, uncertain and challenging as it might be, lay ahead. And in that future, the deep woods and the world of humans were no longer separate. They were intertwined for better or worse in a new reality that held both terror and wonder in equal measure. The story of the deep woods and their inhabitants wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now, at least, it was a story that would be written by both sides, in the complex, messy, beautiful language of coexistence. As night fell and the boundary between the two worlds blurred in the gathering darkness, the deep woods stirred with ancient life and new possibilities. And somewhere in that liminal space, Victor, the man who became a monster, who became something more, watched over the fragile peace, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The alarm pierced through the darkness of my bedroom at 4 a.m., startling me awake. I groaned, my body aching from the previous day's preparation, but the excitement of opening day quickly pushed away any lingering fatigue. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows of my secluded cabin nestled deep in the South Jersey Pine Barrens. I'm Ryan Hawthorne, a 35-year-old local who spent most of my life in these woods. Hunting and fishing aren't just hobbies for me, they're a way of life. The Pine Barrens have been my playground, my provider, and sometimes my tormentor. Little did I know that this day would change my perception of these familiar woods forever. As I pulled on my thermal underwear and layered up with camouflage, I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was the unusual cold. The weatherman had predicted temperatures dropping to -4 with the wind chill, a rarity for New Jersey. Or perhaps it was something else. A primal instinct warning me of unseen dangers lurking in the pre-dawn darkness. I made my way to the kitchen, my boots creaking on the old wooden floor. The coffee maker gurgled, filling the air with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. As I waited, I peered out the window into the inky blackness. The pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying eerily in the biting wind. With my thermos filled and my gear packed, I stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath away. I pulled my scarf tighter around my face and made my way to my truck. The metal of the door handle was so cold it almost burned my skin through my gloves. As I drove down the lonely dirt road leading deeper into the barrens, my headlights caught glimpses of movement in the underbrush. Probably just deer or foxes, I told myself, but a part of me wondered if there were other, less natural explanations for those fleeting shadows. I parked at my usual spot, about a mile from where I'd set up my new stand. This year I'd decided to venture further into the woods, seeking a more challenging hunt. Now, as I shouldered my pack and gripped my shotgun, I questioned the wisdom of that decision. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness as I followed the trail of reflectors I'd set up weeks before. Each step took me further from civilization and deeper into the heart of the barrens. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of decay. My breath came out in plumes of white vapor, dissipating quickly in the frigid air. As I walked, memories of old legends and campfire stories about the Jersey Devil flooded my mind. I'd always scoffed at such tales, considering them nothing more than local folklore designed to scare tourists and children. But in the oppressive darkness of the pre-dawn forest, those stories suddenly felt all too real. I shook my head, trying to dispel such thoughts. I was a rational man, a hunter who knew these woods better than most. There was nothing out here that I couldn't handle. At least that's what I told myself as I continued my solitary trek into the heart of the pine barrens. The sky was just beginning to lighten, a faint grayish tinge on the eastern horizon, as I approached my tree stand. I was about 25 yards away when I decided to take a short break and have a cigarette to calm my nerves. The eerie silence of the woods was getting to me, the usual pre-dawn chorus of birds conspicuously absent. I fumbled with my lighter, my gloved hands clumsy in the biting cold. As the flame flickered to life, illuminating my face in its warm glow, a sound shattered the silence. It wasn't the familiar snort of a deer or the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. No, this was something else entirely. A grunt. No, not just a grunt. A snarl. Deep, guttural, and unmistakably aggressive. I froze, the unlit cigarette dangling from my lips, my hand still holding the lighter. The sound came again, longer this time, a rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. It was close, too close. My heart pounding, I slowly lowered the lighter and gripped my shotgun. Years of hunting experience took over as I scanned the surrounding darkness, straining my eyes to catch any sign of movement. The snarling continued, sometimes stopping for a moment before resuming with increased intensity. Then, without warning, it charged. The creature burst from the underbrush to my left, a dark mass of fur and muscle. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could make out a vague shape, like a massive boar, but wrong. Its head was too large, its snout too elongated, and those eyes, they glowed with an unnatural, almost intelligent malevolence. Training took over. I raised my shotgun and fired, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the scene in stark detail. I caught a glimpse of twisted features, of tusks where they shouldn't be, of too many limbs moving in unnatural coordination. Then darkness again, and the sound of the creature crashing away through the underbrush. My hands shook as I fumbled to reload, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What the hell was that thing? New Jersey didn't have wild boars, and even if it did, no boar looked like that. I needed to get to my tree stand, now. Abandoning all pretense of stealth, I ran towards my tree. I was about 10 yards away when I heard it again, the sound of something large moving through the forest at high speed. But this time, it was behind me. Before I could turn, something slammed into my back with the force of a freight train. I was thrown forward, my face meeting the frozen ground with a sickening crunch. The taste of blood filled my mouth as I lay there, dazed and winded. Whatever had hit me kept going, its heavy footfalls fading into the distance. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, the metallic tang of blood on my tongue. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. My shotgun lay a few feet away, and I crawled towards it, my fingers scrabbling in the leaf litter until they closed around the familiar shape of the stock. Using the gun as a crutch, I hauled myself to my feet and staggered the remaining distance to my tree stand. With trembling hands, I secured my safety harness and began to climb. Each movement sent waves of pain through my battered body, but fear drove me upward. Only when I reached the relative safety of my perch did I allow myself to collapse, gasping for breath. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full horror of what had just happened began to sink in. I'd been attacked, twice, by something that shouldn't exist. My mind struggled to make sense of what I'd seen, to reconcile it with the rational world I thought I knew. I sat in my tree stand until well after sunrise, my shotgun clutched tightly to my chest, jumping at every sound. The woods gradually came to life around me, but it all felt wrong somehow. The bird calls seemed mocking, the rustle of squirrels in the branches sinister. When I finally summoned the courage to descend and make my way back to my truck, I moved with a caution born of newfound fear. The Pine Barrens, once my second home, now felt alien and threatening. Every shadow concealed potential danger, every sound a possible harbinger of that thing's return. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. I knew I should report it, but who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. As I pulled up to my cabin, I made a decision. I would keep this to myself, at least for now. But I knew one thing for certain. My days of hunting alone in the deep woods were over. The days following my terrifying encounter in the woods passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, malevolent orbs staring back at me. The snarl that had shattered the pre-dawn silence echoed in my dreams, jolting me awake in a cold sweat. I threw myself into research, spending countless hours hunched over my laptop, searching for any explanation for what I'd seen. I scoured local wildlife reports, delved into cryptozoology forums, and even found myself reading about genetic mutations and government experiments. Nothing quite fit. The rational part of my brain tried to convince me that it had all been a hallucination, brought on by the extreme cold and the eerie atmosphere of the pre-dawn forest. But the bruises that mottled my body and the lingering ache in my back served as constant reminders that what I'd experienced had been all too real. I became jumpy, starting at every unexpected sound. The creak of my cabin settling in the night wind became the growl of an unseen predator. The scratch of branches against my window in a storm transformed into the scraping of otherworldly claws seeking entry. My few friends in the area noticed the change in me. I'd always been something of a loner, but now I withdrew even further. How could I explain to them what had happened? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, lying for attention. So I made excuses, claimed I was coming down with something, and avoided their invitations to go hunting or fishing. As the days turned into weeks, my fear began to morph into a morbid curiosity. I found myself drawn back to the woods, though I never ventured as deep as I had on that fateful morning. I'd walk the edges of the forest, my shotgun always at the ready, scanning the trees for any sign of the creature. Sometimes, in the fading light of dusk, I thought I caught glimpses of movement just beyond the tree line. A flash of fur, the glint of an unnatural eye, the shadow of a misshapen form. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there but the swaying pines and lengthening shadows. I began to question my sanity. Was I seeing things that weren't there? Had the encounter in the woods broken something in my mind, leaving me forever jumping at shadows? Or was there really something out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity to strike? The not knowing was almost worse than the fear. I found myself longing for another encounter, if only to prove to myself that I wasn't going mad. But at the same time, the thought of coming face to face with that thing again filled me with a bone-deep terror. As autumn deepened into winter, I fell into a routine of sorts. During the day, I'd go about my normal activities, chopping wood, maintaining my cabin, running errands in town. But my nights were spent in vigilant watchfulness, peering out into the darkness, my shotgun never far from reach. I installed motion-activated floodlights around my property, their harsh glare cutting through the night at the slightest disturbance. More often than not, they'd be triggered by deer or raccoons, but each time they blazed to life, my heart would race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. One particularly cold night in early December, I was jolted from an uneasy sleep by the lights suddenly flaring to life. I bolted upright, grabbing my shotgun from where it leaned against my bedside table. As I peered out the window, my breath caught in my throat. There, at the edge of the illuminated area, stood a figure. It was only there for a moment before it melted back into the shadows, but in that brief instant I saw enough to send chills down my spine. It wasn't the creature from the woods. This was something different, but no less terrifying. The figure had been roughly human-shaped, but too tall, too thin. Its limbs were impossibly long, and its head had been wrong, elongated and somehow misshapen. As it retreated into the darkness, I could have sworn I saw it turn to look directly at me, even though I was sure it couldn't have seen me through the window. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, my shotgun clutched to my chest, straining my ears for any sound of approach. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside, searching for tracks or any sign of the nocturnal visitor, but the ground was frozen hard, revealing nothing. As I stood there in the pale morning light, surrounded by the silent pines, a realization settled over me like a shroud. The pine barrens held secrets far darker and more terrifying than I had ever imagined, and somehow I had stumbled into the middle of it all. I knew then that I couldn't stay in my isolated cabin much longer. The solitude that had once been a comfort now felt like a vulnerability. But where could I go? Who would believe my story? And more importantly, would these entities, whatever they were, let me leave? As I turned to go back inside, a movement caught my eye. There, nailed to one of the trees at the edge of my property, was a piece of paper fluttering in the breeze. My blood ran cold as I approached it. The paper was blank except for a crude drawing, a stick figure with elongated limbs and a misshapen head. I tore the paper down, my hands shaking. This was no longer just about what I had seen in the woods. Someone or something was watching me, toying with me. The hunter had become the hunted, and I was trapped in a game whose rules I didn't understand. As I retreated to the relative safety of my cabin, I knew that my life would never be the same. The pine barrens had shown me a glimpse of a world beyond my understanding, and now that world was reaching out to me, whether I wanted it to or not. Months passed, and the horrors of that autumn morning began to fade into a sort of surreal memory. I told myself that the stress and isolation had gotten to me, that I had blown a simple animal encounter out of proportion. The strange figure I'd seen outside my cabin, a trick of the light, nothing more. By the time spring rolled around, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been in my head. Almost. As the days grew longer and warmer, I felt the old familiar pull of the outdoors. The Great Egg Harbor River with its promise of striped bass called to me. I had avoided my favorite fishing spots all winter, but now the lure was too strong to resist. I called up my buddy Mike, figuring some company would help keep the lingering unease at bay. We made plans to hit the river on a Saturday, aiming to catch the outgoing tide. The morning dawned overcast and cool, a light mist hanging over the river as we hiked the old trail to our favorite spot. The path wound through the woods, passing the ruins of an old shipbuilder's yard. As we walked, I found myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see glowing eyes or misshapen figures lurking in the shadows. "You okay, man?" Mike's voice snapped me out of my paranoid observations. "You seem jumpy." I forced a laugh, trying to sound casual. "Just excited to finally get back out here, you know?" Mike nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. I'd been distant over the winter, and though I'd made excuses about being busy with work, I knew he suspected there was more to it. We reached the old structure on the riverbank, a favorite haunt for the stripers we were after. The water gurgled and swirled around the crumbling concrete, creating the perfect hiding spots for big fish. As we set up our gear, the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and a cool breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of ozone and wet earth. "Looks like we might get wet," Mike commented, eyeing the sky warily. I nodded, focused on tying a new lure to my line. "Yeah, but the fish should be biting right before the storm hits." For about an hour we fished in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional splash of our lures hitting the water and the distant rumble of thunder. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the heavens opened up. Rain pounded down in sheets, instantly soaking us to the skin. Lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. We scrambled to gather our gear, the sudden downpour making every movement a struggle. "The old building," I shouted over the roar of the rain, gesturing towards the abandoned structure looming behind us. "We can wait it out in there." Mike nodded, his face a mask of grim determination as we slogged through the quickly forming mud towards the dilapidated edifice. The building, once a hub of shipbuilding activity, now stood as a silent sentinel on the riverbank, its windows dark and empty, its walls covered in graffiti and scarred by time. As we approached, a sense of unease settled over me. Something about the building seemed off. The shadows within seemed deeper than they should be, the silence more profound than mere abandonment could account for. But with the storm raging around us, we had little choice. We ducked through a gap where a door had once been, the sudden absence of rain almost deafening. Water dripped from our clothes and gear, forming small puddles on the dusty floor. The air inside was stale and musty, with an underlying scent I couldn't quite place, something organic and vaguely unsettling. "Well, this is cozy," Mike quipped, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. He moved further into the room, his footsteps stirring up small clouds of dust. "Hey, check it out, there's a second floor. Maybe we can get a view of the river from up there." I hesitated, that feeling of wrongness intensifying. "I don't know, Mike. The structure might not be stable. Maybe we should just stay down here." Mike was already heading for the stairs. "Come on, man. Where's your sense of adventure? We came out here to explore, didn't we?" Reluctantly, I followed him up the creaking stairs, each step sending shivers of apprehension down my spine. The second floor was a long hallway with rooms on the right and a balcony overlooking the main floor on the left. Graffiti covered the walls, some of it typical tags and crude drawings, but some seemed older, stranger. Symbols I didn't recognize and couldn't begin to decipher. Mike headed for the first door, his hand reaching for the rusted knob. Suddenly he stopped, his body going rigid. "You know what?" he said, his voice oddly strained. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Let's head back down." I was about to agree when something caught my eye, a flicker of movement at the far end of the hallway. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Mike shook his head, already turning back towards the stairs. "I didn't see anything, and I don't want to. This place gives me the creeps. Let's go." But I couldn't move. That sense of wrongness had crystallized into a tangible feeling of dread, rooting me to the spot. As Mike's footsteps faded down the stairs, I found myself drawn further down the hallway towards the last door. With each step, the feeling intensified. It was as if all the sorrow, fear, and malice that had ever existed in this place was concentrated behind that final door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. The door swung open with a long, low creak. The room beyond was dark, the lone window covered in years of grime. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes, strange twisted forms that seemed to writhe in the shadows. And in the center of it all, a figure. It was small, child-sized, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Its proportions were off, its limbs too long and jointed in impossible ways. And its face, where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse of skin. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. The figure turned towards me, moving with a fluidity that defied physics. And then, impossibly, a mouth opened in that blank face, a gash filled with needle-like teeth. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, taking the stairs 3 at a time, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I burst out of the building into the rain, which had slackened to a steady drizzle. Mike was there, looking concerned and a little annoyed. "Jesus, Ryan, what the hell happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the building, trying to convey through gesture the horror I'd witnessed. Mike's expression changed from annoyance to concern. "Okay, man, okay, let's get out of here. We can come back for the rest of the gear later." As we hurried back along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig underfoot, sent jolts of fear through me. It wasn't until we reached Mike's truck that I began to feel like I could breathe again. The drive back was silent, Mike shooting concerned glances my way every few minutes. I knew I owed him an explanation, but how could I possibly describe what I'd seen? How could I make him understand when I didn't understand it myself? That night, alone in my cabin, I finally allowed myself to break down. The tears came in great, heaving sobs as the full weight of what I'd experienced crashed over me. This wasn't just a one-time encounter with something strange in the woods. This was something more, something that defied explanation or rationality. As I sat there, surrounded by the familiar comforts of my home, I realized that everything had changed. The world I thought I knew, the reality I had always taken for granted, had been torn away. In its place was something darker, stranger, and infinitely more terrifying. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed help, needed to understand what was happening. But who could I turn to? Who would believe me? As if in answer to my unspoken question, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number and contained only 4 words: "We need to talk." The text message haunted me for days. I debated responding, torn between my desperate need for answers and my fear of delving deeper into whatever dark mystery I'd stumbled upon. In the end, curiosity won out over caution. I replied with a simple, "Who is this?" The response came almost immediately. "Someone who knows what you've seen. Meet me at the Crossroads Diner, tomorrow, noon." The Crossroads Diner was a small, nondescript eatery on the outskirts of town, the kind of place truckers and locals frequented for cheap coffee and greasy food. It was public enough to feel safe, but isolated enough for a private conversation. I arrived early, my nerves jangling with each step. The diner was nearly empty, just a couple of regulars nursing cups of coffee at the counter. I slid into a booth near the back, positioning myself so I could see both the entrance and the emergency exit. At precisely noon, the bell over the door jingled. A woman entered, her eyes scanning the diner before settling on me. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined with age and worry, her eyes sharp and penetrating. Without a word, she slid into the booth across from me. Up close, I could see the deep shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she picked up the menu. "You're Ryan Hawthorne," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "And you are?" "Margaret Blackburn," she replied, her voice low and gravelly. "I've been watching you, Ryan, ever since your encounter in the woods last fall." A chill ran down my spine. "How do you—" She held up a hand, cutting me off. "I know because I've seen it too. We all have, those of us who know the truth about this place." The waitress approached, and Margaret ordered coffee for both of us. When she left, Margaret leaned in, her voice dropping even lower. "The Pine Barrens hold secrets, Ryan. Ancient secrets. Things that most people can't even begin to comprehend. What you saw in the woods, what you encountered in that old building by the river, they're just the tip of the iceberg." My mind reeled, struggling to process her words. But what were they? Some kind of animal? A hallucination? Margaret's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "If only it were that simple. No, Ryan. What you've encountered are entities that exist beyond our normal perception of reality. Some call them spirits, others demons. The local Lenape people had their own names for them, passed down through generations." She paused as the waitress returned with our coffee. When she left, Margaret continued, "These entities have always been here, as much a part of the Pine Barrens as the trees and the sand. Most of the time they remain hidden, glimpsed only out of the corner of your eye or in the depths of the darkest night. But sometimes they become more active, more visible." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a deep, abiding fear. "Because something is changing. The balance that has kept them in check for centuries is shifting, and if it's not stopped, the consequences will be unimaginable." I sat back, my head spinning. Part of me wanted to dismiss her words as the ravings of a madwoman, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, and deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. "What can we do?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Margaret smiled, a grim, determined expression. That's why I contacted you, Ryan. There's a group of us, people who know the truth, who've dedicated our lives to maintaining the balance. We need your help." As she spoke, laying out the existence of a secret society dedicated to protecting the world from otherworldly threats, I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. This was insanity, and yet it was the first thing that had made sense since that fateful morning in the woods. "I'm in," I said, surprising myself with my conviction. "Whatever it takes, I want to understand. I want to help." Margaret nodded, relief evident in her eyes. "Good, because we're running out of time. The entities are growing bolder, manifesting more frequently. We believe they're building towards something big, something that could tear the very fabric of our reality apart." As we left the diner, the weight of my new knowledge pressing down on me like a physical force, Margaret handed me a small, leather-bound journal. "This contains some of what we know," she said. "Study it, memorize it, and be ready. I'll contact you again soon." That night, as I pored over the journal by lamplight, my world expanded and contracted simultaneously. The pages were filled with accounts of encounters similar to mine, stretching back centuries. Detailed descriptions of entities that defied comprehension, rituals to ward them off, maps marked with places of power and danger. As I read, I began to see the Pine Barrens with new eyes. The forests I'd known all my life were now a battlefield, a thin veil between our world and something infinitely more terrifying. And I was now a soldier in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind racing with possibilities and dangers. When dawn finally broke, I made a decision. I would embrace this new reality, this hidden world. I would learn, prepare, and fight if necessary. Because if Margaret was right, the fate of everything I knew and loved hung in the balance. And I was damned if I was going to sit idly by and watch it fall. The weeks following my meeting with Margaret were a whirlwind of preparation and revelation. I devoured the contents of the journal she had given me, my mind struggling to comprehend the vastness of the hidden world it described. Ancient rituals, arcane symbols, accounts of encounters that defied rational explanation. It was all there, a secret history of the Pine Barrens that few had ever known. Margaret contacted me sporadically, always through untraceable means. Burner phones, encrypted emails, even once through a message left under a specific pine tree deep in the woods. Each communication brought new information, new tasks to complete. I learned to create protective sigils, tracing them in salt around my cabin. I memorized incantations in languages long dead, their syllables feeling strange and powerful on my tongue. I trained my body and mind, pushing myself to new limits of endurance and perception. Through it all, the entities Margaret had spoken of made their presence known. Shadows that moved against the wind, whispers in empty rooms, fleeting glimpses of impossible forms at the edge of my vision. But now, armed with knowledge and purpose, I faced these manifestations with determination rather than fear. It was a month after our initial meeting when Margaret finally deemed me ready for what she called the initiation. Her message was cryptic. "Midnight, the old cedar grove. Come alone and be prepared for anything." I knew the place she meant, an ancient stand of cedar trees deep in the heart of the barrens, far from any trails or roads. As I made my way there under the light of a waning moon, every sense was on high alert. The forest seemed alive in a way I'd never experienced before, pulsing with an energy that set my teeth on edge. The grove itself was a place of primal power. The cedars, gnarled and twisted with age, formed a natural circle around a small clearing. As I stepped into that space, I felt a change in the air, as if I'd crossed some invisible threshold into another world. Margaret was there, along with 5 others, 3 men and 2 women, all of varying ages but sharing the same look of grim determination I'd seen in Margaret's eyes that day in the diner. They stood in a loose circle, each holding a candle that cast flickering shadows across their faces. "Welcome, Ryan," Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority I hadn't heard before. "You stand now at the crossroads of worlds. Are you prepared to take the final step? To see the truth that lies beyond the veil?" I swallowed hard, my mouth dry with anticipation and fear. "I am." What followed was a ceremony unlike anything I could have imagined. Chants in languages that resonated in my bones, symbols drawn in earth and fire, rituals that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality around us. As the ceremony reached its climax, I felt a shift, not just in the world around me, but within myself. It was as if a veil had been lifted from my eyes. The grove came alive with light and movement. Beings of impossible geometry flitted between the trees, their forms shifting and changing with each passing moment. The air itself seemed to ripple with currents of energy, visible now to my enhanced perception. And there, at the center of it all, stood a figure that defied description. It was as if someone had taken all the primal forces of nature, the fury of a storm, the majesty of a mountain, the depth of the sea, and condensed them into a single, awe-inspiring form. When it spoke, its voice resonated not in my ears, but in the very core of my being. "Ryan Hawthorne," it said, my name carrying a weight and significance I'd never felt before. "You have been chosen. The balance teeters on the edge of chaos. Will you stand as a guardian against the coming darkness?" In that moment, faced with the raw power of creation and destruction, I understood the true magnitude of what I was being asked to do. This wasn't just about protecting the Pine Barrens or even our world. This was about maintaining the very fabric of reality itself. "I will," I said, my voice strong and sure despite the trembling in my limbs. The entity, for lack of a better term, seemed to nod, though the motion was more a shift in the energies surrounding it than a physical movement. "Then receive our blessing and our burden." A surge of energy slammed into me, filling every cell of my body with liquid fire. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by sensations I had no words to describe. Visions flashed before my eyes, past, present, and possible futures, all intertwined in a tapestry of cosmic significance. When it was over, I found myself lying on my back in the clearing, the first light of dawn peeking through the cedars. The others stood around me, their faces a mix of concern and respect. Margaret helped me to my feet, her touch steadying me as I swayed. "Welcome to the Order," she said softly. "Your real work begins now." As we left the grove, I knew that my life had changed irrevocably. I was no longer just Ryan Hawthorne, local hunter and fisherman. I was now a guardian, a protector of realities, initiated into secrets that most of humanity could never comprehend. The Pine Barrens stretched out before me, familiar yet utterly transformed. With my new perception, I could see the currents of energy flowing through the land, the hidden doorways to other realms, the creatures that existed between the spaces we normally perceive. It was beautiful, terrifying, and overwhelming. But as the weight of my new responsibilities settled onto my shoulders, I felt a sense of purpose that I'd never known before. Whatever challenges lay ahead. In the months following my initiation, life took on a surreal quality. By day, I maintained the facade of normality, tending to my cabin, going into town for supplies, even the occasional fishing trip with unsuspecting friends. But my nights were filled with patrols of the Barrens, warding rituals, and clandestine meetings with other members of the Order. I learned that our group, officially known as the Guardians of the Veil, had existed for centuries. Its members were drawn from all walks of life, teachers, park rangers, local politicians, and more, all united by their awareness of the hidden world and their commitment to protecting the balance. Margaret, I discovered, was more than just a member. She was our local leader, a position she'd held for over 3 decades. Under her guidance, I honed my newfound abilities. I learned to sense the subtle shifts in energy that signaled an entity's presence, to communicate with the spirits of the land, and even to manipulate the threads of reality itself to a small degree. But for all our vigilance, the situation in the Barrens was deteriorating. Entity sightings were becoming more frequent and more violent. Hikers reported being chased by shadows that moved against the wind. Campers woke to find impossible geometries carved into the trees around their sites. And in the nearby towns, an oppressive atmosphere of dread began to settle, leading to increased reports of nightmares, unexplained illnesses, and erratic behavior. It was during a particularly tense meeting of the Guardians that we received the news we'd been dreading. Elias, our resident scholar and expert on interdimensional phenomena, burst into Margaret's living room, his usually calm demeanor shattered. "It's happening," he gasped, his face pale and drawn. "The convergence, it's starting." A hush fell over the room, We'd all heard whispers of the convergence, a rare alignment of cosmic forces that weakened the barriers between dimensions. But according to our records, it wasn't due for another 50 years. Margaret's voice cut through the silence. "How long do we have?" Elias shook his head, his hands trembling as he spread out a series of charts and diagrams on the coffee table. "Days, a week at most. The signs are unmistakable. The energy patterns, the increased entity activity, it's all pointing to a major event centered right here in the Barrens." I leaned in, studying the complex web of lines and symbols on Elias's charts. Even with my limited experience, I could see the pattern forming, a spiral of energy converging on a single point deep in the heart of the Pine Barrens. "What happens if we can't stop it?" I asked, dreading the answer. Margaret's face was grim. "Best case scenario? A massive incursion of entities into our world beyond anything we've ever dealt with before. Worst case." She trailed off, her eyes distant. "The complete collapse of the barrier between dimensions. Reality as we know it would cease to exist." The weight of her words settled over the room like a shroud. We were facing a threat beyond anything in living memory, with the fate of not just the Pine Barrens, but potentially the entire world hanging in the balance. "So what do we do?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Margaret looked around the room, her gaze lingering on each of us in turn. "We prepare. We gather every resource, call in every favor, and when the time comes, we stand together against whatever comes through." The next few days were a blur of feverish activity. We scoured ancient texts for forgotten rituals, reinforced the wards around key locations in the Barrens, and reached out to other chapters of the Guardians across the country for support. I found myself thrust into a central role, my unique connection to the land, forged through years of hunting and living in the Barrens, proving invaluable in our preparations. I led scouting parties deep into the woods, mapping out the shifting energies and identifying potential weak points in the dimensional barrier. As we worked, the world around us seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of the forest bird calls, rustling leaves, the buzz of insects, fell silent. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension that set our teeth on edge. Even those unaware of the coming crisis could sense that something was wrong, as evidenced by the steadily emptying campgrounds and the increase in closed-for-renovation signs on local businesses. It was during one of our scouting missions, just 3 days before Elias's predicted convergence, that we had our first major encounter. I was leading a small team myself, Elias, and a newer member named Cassie, through a particularly dense section of the Barrens when the air around us suddenly grew cold. Our breaths came out in visible puffs despite the summer heat. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches reaching for us like grasping fingers. And then we saw it, a tear in the very fabric of reality, hanging in the air like a jagged wound. Through the rift, we caught glimpses of a world that defied comprehension. Impossible colors swirled in patterns that hurt to look at. Shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our minds could process, writhed and pulsed. And emerging from this maelstrom of chaos were things, entities beyond anything we'd encountered before. They poured through the rift, a tide of nightmare made flesh. Some were vaguely humanoid, but with too many limbs, joints bending in impossible ways. Others were more abstract, masses of tentacles and eyes and gnashing teeth. And all of them radiated an aura of otherworldly malevolence that sent waves of primal terror through me. Training took over. Cassie began the warding chant, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her eyes. Elias pulled out a device of his own creation, a sort of interdimensional tuning fork, and began adjusting the local vibrational frequency to destabilize the entities. And me? I did what I'd been preparing for all these months. I reached deep into the power that flowed through the land, drawing it up through my feet, through my body, focusing it into a pure beam of protective energy. As the first wave of entities reached us, I released that energy in a blinding flash of light. The creatures recoiled, their forms seeming to waver and distort, but more kept coming. For every one we forced back, 2 more took its place. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and quickly running out of options. Just as I thought we were about to be overwhelmed, a new sound cut through the chaos, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and suddenly the trees around us came alive. Branches lashed out, entangling the entities. Roots erupted from the ground, forming barriers between us and the onslaught. And there, emerging from the trunk of the largest pine, was a figure I recognized from my initiation, the nature spirit, the embodiment of the barrens itself. Its presence turned the tide. The entities, faced with the combined might of our defenses and the raw power of the land, began to retreat. One by one they were sucked back through the rift, which slowly began to close. As the last of the creatures disappeared and the tear sealed itself with a sound like tearing silk, we collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. The spirit regarded us silently for a moment before melting back into the tree from which it had emerged. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As we made our weary way back to report what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a preview of what was to come. The convergence was still approaching, and with it, a threat that made this encounter look like a mere skirmish. Our time was running out. The final confrontation loomed on the horizon, and the fate of everything we knew hung in the balance. As the pine barrens grew darker and more ominous around us, I steeled myself for what was to come. Whatever happened, I knew that the next few days would determine not just my fate, but the fate of our entire reality. The day of the convergence dawned with an eerie stillness. The sky was a uniform gray, as if all color had been leached from the world. As I stood on the porch of my cabin preparing for what lay ahead, I could feel the wrongness in the air. A palpable sense of reality stretched to its breaking point. We had spent the last 48 hours in a frenzy of preparation. Every guardian within a 500-mile radius had converged on the Pine Barrens. Our headquarters, a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town, had been transformed into a war room, with maps, mystical artifacts, and weapons both mundane and arcane covering every available surface. Margaret had been in constant motion, coordinating our defenses, assigning teams, and poring over ancient texts for any advantage we could gain. I had never seen her look so haggard, the weight of leadership etched into the lines of her face. As I made my way to HQ for our final briefing, I couldn't help but reflect on how much my life had changed in such a short time. Just months ago, my biggest concern had been where to set up my deer stand for the coming season. Now I was preparing to face down forces that could unravel the very fabric of our reality. The warehouse was a hive of activity when I arrived. Guardians from all walks of life were gearing up, park rangers strapping on body armor alongside academics double-checking mystical formulae, local shopkeepers standing shoulder to shoulder with hardened monster hunters. Margaret called us to order, her voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "Listen up, everyone. This is it. Everything we've trained for, everything we've sacrificed for, it all comes down to the next few hours." She laid out the plan. We would split into teams, each responsible for a different aspect of our defense. Some would focus on reinforcing the weakening dimensional barriers. Others would engage directly with any entities that managed to break through. And a select few, including myself, would attempt to close the convergence point itself. "Make no mistake," Margaret continued, her eyes sweeping the room. "This will be the fight of our lives. Many of us may not make it back. But remember what we're fighting for. Not just for the Pine Barrens, not just for our world, but for the very concept of reality as we know it." As we moved out, the air grew thicker, more oppressive. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. In the distance I could hear sounds that had no place in this world. Chittering whispers, discordant melodies, and beneath it all, a deep, subsonic rumble that I felt more than heard. Our team, consisting of myself, Elias, Cassie, and two seasoned guardians named Ravi and Samantha, made our way deep into the heart of the Barrens. With each step, the world around us seemed to warp and twist. Colors bled into one another, shadows moved against the light, and more than once I caught glimpses of impossible geometries out of the corner of my eye. We reached the convergence point just as all hell broke loose. The sky above us tore open, revealing a swirling vortex of cosmic energy. Through this rift poured a nightmarish horde of entities, some familiar from our previous encounters, others so alien and terrifying that my mind recoiled from the sight of them. "Now," Elias shouted, pulling out the device he'd been working on, a complex arrangement of crystals, circuits, and arcane symbols that he claimed could disrupt the convergence. We formed a protective circle around him as he began the activation sequence. Cassie and I focused on maintaining a barrier of protective energy, while Ravi and Samantha engaged directly with the encroaching entities. The air crackled with eldritch energy as we fought. I drew deep on the power of the land, channeling it through my body in ways I never thought possible. Bolts of pure force lashed out from my hands, driving back the creatures that threatened to overwhelm us. But for every entity we repelled, two more took its place. The sheer variety of horrors we faced was staggering. Beings of living shadow, crystalline monstrosities that shattered and reformed at will, things that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our minds could comprehend. Just as I thought we might be overrun, a familiar presence made itself known. The spirit of the Pine Barrens, the entity I had encountered during my initiation, manifested in all its terrifying glory. It joined our battle, its power dwarfing our own, driving back the invading forces with primal fury. With this momentary respite, Elias was able to complete the activation of his device. A pulse of energy exploded outward, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. The entities hung suspended in midair, the swirling vortex above us stilled. Then, with a sound like reality itself screaming, the rift began to close. The invading entities were sucked back through, their unearthly shrieks fading as they disappeared. The cosmic energies that had threatened to tear our world apart receded, leaving behind an almost painful normalcy. As the last of the anomalies faded, we collapsed to the ground, exhausted beyond measure. The forest around us slowly came back to life, birds cautiously resuming their songs, small animals emerging from hiding. We had done it. We had faced down the impossible and emerged victorious. The convergence had been stopped, the barriers between worlds restored. But as we made our weary way back to headquarters, I knew that this was not truly an end, but a beginning. The veil had been lifted, and I could never unsee what I had witnessed. The world was vaster, stranger, and more perilous than I had ever imagined. As we gathered at the warehouse, battered but alive, Margaret addressed us one final time. "Today we've won a great victory," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "But our work is far from over. The barriers between worlds will always be fragile, and there will always be those who seek to exploit that fragility. We must remain vigilant, ready to stand against whatever threats may come." Looking around at my fellow guardians, some faces familiar, others new, all forever changed by what we had experienced, I felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything I had known before. This was my calling, my duty, to stand as a protector of reality itself, a guardian of the veil between worlds. As I returned to my cabin that night, the Pine Barrens stretched out around me, familiar yet forever changed. I knew that danger still lurked in the shadows, that cosmic horrors still waited just beyond the veil of our reality. But I also knew that we would be ready to face them. For in the heart of the Pine Barrens, in the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the play of shadows in the deepening twilight, a new chapter had begun. And I, Ryan Hawthorne, once a simple hunter and fisherman, now stood as a guardian of realities, a protector of the veil, ready to face whatever nightmares might come.